spots where it's difficult. We have another La Nina, we could start to see drought conditions worsen again. And if we get a below normal precipitation forecast for the next few months, we could get into the same scenario that we had last year. So when you look at the overall drought outlook, it looks like we're going to have drought persisting through the next 3 or so months. You can see the dark brown areas in the western part of the United States. That's going to continue, and La Nina's projected to continue also. On October 14th, NOAA they came out with a prediction, and the outlook calls for an 87% chance of La Nina during the December 2021 to February 2022 timeframe. So again, the outlook is still bad, and this is what concerns me the most, is the reservoir levels. So the precipitation is one thing, but where's our drought supply? Where's our reservoirs? You can see the empty cups all over the state of New Mexico, essentially, that are out there, and the ones that are real significant are the ones on the Rio Grande. If you look at just the Elephant Butte being at 4% of capacity, and when you look at this chart, the red line is the reservoir average, the dashed line is last year's volume, and in the blue level here is the current volume of our reservoirs. You can see how poorly our reservoirs and what poor condition they're in. The Elephant Butte, as I said, is about a 4% of capacity. It's the current status, and it's about 100,000. This is back in August. I couldn't get one that was more recent than that, but you get the idea here. When you have 4% of capacity for that and Caballo, the lower Rio Grande is again in dire straits. You have the same thing along the Pecos, and so you can look at your numbers here. Very paltry amounts of water in our storage, which really concerns a lot of the water users, especially the irrigation communities around the state. I'm gonna go to budgets because I think it's really important for folks to understand what our budgets are in New Mexico and where we really need, and this helps explain what we're trying to get to. I won't go into all the impacts, but in fiscal 21 and 22, we had general fund cuts, we had general fund reductions, we had hiring freezes. Our authorized personnel went from 342 to 317 because a lot of our positions were vacant for 2 years. That 317 number has actually been reduced now to 314. Again, looking at high vacancy rates, low employment rates. And the other thing that's really significant is our trust funds. We've been living on trust funds for our operating conditions, which has got to change. We need some recurring funding. And so we've got some insolvency problems that the legislature needs to fix that created it, and we're working with them. But just as far as the staffing challenges, we've been very busy. We had 72 recruitment hires completed in the last 13 months, which is 23% of our workforce. But we've completed, and out of those 72 hires, when we look at them, 19 were from the outside. 53 of them were internal hires, which means there's no net increase in our full-time equivalent staff, and it's just a matter of getting the most qualified person in there. But by hiring and promoting from within, you also have to do a double hire in order to fill those the vacant positions. We've got 28 recruitments that are currently in process, but we're losing employees on the back end. We've had 28 that we've lost in the last 13 months, 13 through retirements. And another 15 terminations or transfers to other agencies, where a lot of the agencies are robbing technical expertise from the other agencies, and people go into the private sector. And then some high-level retiring folks with 20 years of service that are retiring, which is really hurting, and it's a brain drain for the agency. The staffing challenges, again, there's no increase in staff to handle the regular workload, much less the drought and special initiatives. All the issues we're dealing with our challenges on the lower Rio Grande and Texas v. New Mexico, the Colorado shortages. It's really time consuming to get into the hiring process. We're looking at and need employees that are legal, engineering, science, hydrology, those areas. We're also competing against the oil and gas industry. And the bottom bullet is the most important one for everybody to understand. When I was a state engineer 10, 12 years ago during the Richardson administration, we had 312 filled positions. We only have 245 filled positions. That's 67 less full-time equivalent positions. That translates into 140,000 less staff hours per year. That's a lot of hours, a lot of work that can get done. And it's no wonder we were so successful in the mid 2000s in getting Indian water rights settlements done. A lot of the active water resource management initiative and everything else. We are nowhere near the staffing levels that we need to go for us to be able to do the state's work and to protect our water resources, and those have to change. Here's our vacancy summaries by our program. You can see we've got our water resource allocation programs, our largest program, that's the Water Rights Division offices, our dam safety, hydrology, and Water Use and Conservation Bureau. We have almost a 20% vacancy rate there. Interstate Stream Commission, about a 14% vacancy rate. Litigation and Adjudication Program, about a 30% vacancy rate. In our program support, almost 27%. The composites, about a 22% vacancy rate. 69 vacant positions, 40 of those are unfunded. We've got 28 actions that are going on right now, but you can see it's a difficult issue that we're trying to deal with. And what we've done is we put a budget and staffing alignment and request together with the governor's climate change and water management priorities. And I'm going to go through these fast, but it shows you how important it is, and this really explains what we're doing within the agency and gives you a good idea of what our work focus is. Extreme drought and climate change initiatives. We're going through and how do we increase those FTEs, asking for an additional 6 for our Water Rights Division offices, essentially to deal with our backlog and applications, water master support, the Nambe Puake Tsuki settlement, just doing the administration there in that particular area. We've got cannabis coming up, cannabis production, asking for 4 additional positions in our Water Rights Division offices. We're looking at supporting and developing district-specific regulations, a few more FTEs here, and I won't go through all of these, but you can see that there's a big need for additional modeling. Some of the other unfunded mandates that we continue to get from the legislature, we need 17 additional folks just for handling the extreme drought and climate initiatives. I'm going to move quickly to Indian water rights settlements, implementation and negotiation initiatives. We're asking for, and again, if you look at this, we're asking for 8 additional staff. It breaks down to 3 technical staff in our WRRI program, another couple attorneys for Interstate Stream Commission, and 3 FTEs for litigation and adjudication program, and some money for technical support for Indian water rights negotiations. We've got the 3 settlements that we're working on to complete implementation phase, but then we've got another 5, 6 active adjudications involving 9 tribes, pueblos, and nations, and we've got to be able to meet with federal negotiation teams and get those negotiations and settlements moving so that we can actually make some progress in the certainty of our water rights within the state of New Mexico. Interstate litigation and settlement negotiations, litigation avoidance initiatives. We've got the huge challenges on Texas v. New Mexico. Whatever happens with that litigation, and we feel like we're in a good stand right now, we've got to come in and still back that up with additional administrative staff down in the lower Rio Grande. We're being challenged in the Colorado River for shortages on that system, which ultimately feed into the middle Rio Grande. We're asking for 2 positions in each of those in our ISC program. And then additional funding, non-recurring special funding of $5 million to support the litigation that's ongoing in Texas v. New Mexico. And litigation avoidance, because of all the work that we have to do in the Colorado system to be able to work with the 7 basin states within the Colorado. to effectively put policy and procedures in place for the drought contingency plan that's been signed in that particular basin. We're also looking at the Hickory Apache a lease of their water with the San Juan generating station closing, and the availability of water there. It becomes important to be able to use that water in meeting our shortages within the state and looking at those particular areas. Capital outlay to support. We've got a lot of projects that's levee projects, Rio Grande Channel maintenance, strategic water reserve that we're looking at. Again, this is non-recurring capital, but again, important for it to get funded within our state agency. The 50-year water plan. You've probably heard a lot about that in this conference already. We need support. We haven't had the support. We asked for $750,000 last year. Didn't get a penny from the state legislature. And we also asked for positions. We're continuing to ask for those positions again this year. Again, for FTE to help implement the 50-year water plan for the Interstate Stream Commission. We've got a GIS application position and some external support. We're leveraging some of the Corps of Engineers planning assistance to the state's programs. We're not asking for as much money this year, but $350,000 along with 5 FTEs to address this initiative. And then we've got infrastructure innovation, dam safety initiatives. We've got $300 million of inadequate and deficient dams within the state of New Mexico. We need to, and our Dam Safety Bureau, we're just regulatory. We need to establish some project management unit if we're going to get funding that goes to those rehabilitation projects. We need capital project management folks. We need financial administration and assistance there. There's also some dam safety risk. You know, if we're going to go in and look at $300 million worth of projects, we need to be able to gauge the risk and triage the risk so that we can actually prioritize those particular projects and move forward. And so we're asking for 4 additional staff there, some additional non-recurring funding within the budget. Long-term budget sustainability, our trust funds are going to nothing. We're looking for $10 million that we need to replace general fund to our agency, which the legislature has taken away over a number of years, getting it into our particular programs, and then in a one-time infusion into the trust funds to help. That's going on. It's a big problem. Back in 2019, the legislature had recognized it and said, "Hey, state engineer, put together a 5-year plan so we can get you general fund back." And we're still working and fighting to be able to get general fund for the agency. So those two trust funds can be used for what their intended purpose is. I'm going to go to and show you the trust funds that are dwindling. The red line here represents the balance. You can see the balance of our 2 trust funds that we use. We're over $30 million, back in FY10 and FY11. Have gradually gone down. That's the fund balance, and because there's a disparity between the expenditures, which is the yellow line, and the total revenue, which is here you can see this $10 million gap on a year-to-year basis. We need to change that. This fund is going to zero, and we've alerted the state, the legislature, the last 2.5 years. Every single presentation we do, we highlight this. And I think this year maybe they'll do something. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Water data initiative. Again, this is extremely important for us to be able to move forward. Our IT challenges are enormous. We're asking for about $1.38 million here to support a lot of what the Water Data Act has put in place. We saw our representative Stansberry, who when she was in the state helped start that particular Water Data Act, along with Stacy Timmons and some other folks that are really active in it. But we need water rights information, subfile information, hydrographic survey, water use data, meter readings, all that to roll up into an initiative to help us actively manage our water. And again, it requires funding, and we've been unfunded mandate for the state engineer's office. And then let me just quickly go into the information technology requests that we have. We have a modernization. We've got aging infrastructure, our water resource, our water rights adjudication tracking system is what RAT stands for. That's our adjudication program. We've got a $3 million plus request in to get that funded. We've got 25-year-old aging infrastructure that we need to get changed. That's software, hardware. We need to move into the to this real-time management, and it requires some upgrades. So hitting these high points here, and you can see the expansion totals are pretty significant. But I mentioned we're short 67 people from 10 plus years ago. We're trying to get 38 of them back. This $14 million here, 10 million of it is replacement of general fund. So about 4.7 million represents this 38 FTE, and then some non-recurring specials to get the funding requested up. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm in Water Trust Board more. I just came from a meeting there. I know we don't have a lot of time. I think I was scheduled for just 20 minutes. And I have a lot of other things I can.
You can take what you need, because we had a speaker get sick in the next session.
Oh, good. So if I have a few more minutes, I'd love to be able to get into some of the detail that we have. So I just want to be respectful of your time. So give me a heads up if I'm taking too long. I get plenty I can talk about here. Let me move to cannabis, because that's a big issue. Another unfunded mandate for the state engineer's office. But working with regulations and licensing department, we have there's a legal right to use the quantity of water that, when we talk about the division here, that's regulation and licensing division. They have to determine a need for cannabis production, and so anybody that uses and puts cannabis into production, there needs to be documentation from a water provider that the applicant has the right to use the water from that provider, and that the use of the water for cannabis production is compliant with the rules. So extremely important to be able to do that. The licensing requirements themselves, any existing water rights that the prospective licensees have documented, they have to show that they have a purpose and place of use that satisfies the rules requirements before, and that's before change. So if they're going in and looking to acquire a water right, and it's for a different purpose, they've got to go in and do a change to the state's engineering permitting process for a change, place, purpose of use that requires an effort. Any cannabis establishment that uses greenhouses, the indoor use needs to be designated as for commercial use, as opposed to irrigation, which again only applies to outdoor agriculture. So one of the big questions that we get, and a lot of folks think that because they have a domestic well for non-commercial cannabis, maybe they're for their own use or whatever, that's allowable by law. They can't use it for commercial sales. I mean, that's not allowable. And there's a lot of misinformation, I think, out there. Our website's got frequently asked questions that we're going through. But when you get into commercial crops, including cannabis, cannabis producers are going to have to acquire valid irrigation rights for outdoor cultivation or commercial rights for indoor cultivation. That's just something that's got to happen. So that's hot off the press here. Another big deal around the state, and I think it's the Water Use Leasing Act and preliminary approvals. That's a tool that the state engineer values. I mean, we have that ability to go in and actually approve a lease permit application, and so it allows for us to give a preliminary approval of a lease application prior to going to notice and to hearing. And then when we get into that, but we still have to do a determination that the temporary use under that lease will not impair existing rights, will not be contrary to conservation within the state of New Mexico, or detrimental to the public welfare. The preliminary approvals, they're really a critical tool. As I mentioned, we use them for a lot of different uses, and you can see here, agricultural water right owners, there's a 5-year accounting period. that we just went through in the Pecos Valley that allows for reconciliation of maybe some overuses and some leasing. It's really important to be able to do that. The Department of Transportation relies on that practice for road construction. Really important to keep those tools available for that use. And there's a wide array of other users that rely on that practice. We've had there's time-sensitive construction and award constructions that we need to have in place, and you've got such things as oil and gas use. And again, allowing the oil and gas is one thing I want to talk about is we've got to allow for a transition to using produced water in the fracking process. And we should be getting there hopefully quickly, so we're not using fresh water for some of those purposes. But there's got to be a transition. The importance of the oil and gas industry to the state of New Mexico is out there. We've got things like the construction of the spaceport, where we use preliminary approval, huge solar arrays that are contemplated by the Energy Transaction Act. We've got over the state of New Mexico. We couldn't get timely projects in place if we didn't have this tool. And I think I want to clear a misconception that it doesn't deprive any other water right owner of due process. We've got preliminary approvals are required to be conditioned again, that the diversions do not impair other water right users. And so that'll probably come up in the next, maybe in the legislative session after this again. And we're working on some, I think some compromises to put a policy in place. I mean, the policy that's important is the use restrictions, limiting groundwater and surface water to certain time restrictions and amount restrictions. And I think we can handle 95% of the requests we have out there if we put those in place. Just quickly on Texas v. New Mexico, and I think the real important piece of that is we're working really closely with the New Mexico Attorney General, and we have a lot of really world-class technical experts on New Mexico's side, and we're really excited about where we're going. We've got a really strong case that's going on right now within, it's going to hearing. I just want to give you a little bit of an update of where we're at on this. The trial was set for September 13th, if you remember, and we're headed in that towards that date, getting prepared. We were prepared. New Mexico was fully intending to litigate it at that point. Texas asked for a continuance. The special master pushed the trial back for 3 weeks, starting October the 4th, but he also split it. We're just doing what we call the precipient witnesses, fact witnesses now. We're halfway into a 3-week session here. We've got several hundred exhibits and witnesses that have been that have testified already. We've got about 16 witnesses for New Mexico that are going to be finishing up in the next 2 weeks. And just from my perspective, we've got a great team, great presentation. I think a great handle on what's going on. The trial's going to suspend and then pick up again on March the 14th with expert witnesses. And so I expect to be on in that phase of the trial next March. The special master, they went on a tour in southern New Mexico to look at the project. And we just wanted to say we haven't given up on settlement. We're engaging a different mediator, and we'll try again during the break. So the break between November the 14th and when we start up again in March, we should, I feel like we may have a good idea of where all the parties stand after this initial trial phase and the witnesses that have testified now. And the case, just bottom line, is about fairness. New Mexico is entitled to 57% of the share, and New Mexico is not getting 57% of the share on that compact. And so I think we're again excited about where the trial's headed, and we look forward to a possible mediated solution if we can get there.
Hey, John, on that positive note, the speakers are ready for their next session. Just to give you an alert.
Okay, And I can just close it by saying we've got the Lower Rio Grande Water Conservation Pilot Program is continuing. We've got a grant period that we put in place. We had an extension that ended on October the 22nd. So again, this is hot off the press. We're showing here we had 46 applications. We had another 4, I think, that came in at the last minute. So we've got about 50 applications for grant funding from the state, from the Interstate Stream Commission. Over 2,600 acres. It might be close to 3,000 now by those last 4 applications. But again, a successful program, paying farmers to fallow. And just one last item: the Colorado River Basin. It's a huge issue. We signed this drought contingency plan. I was in a meeting yesterday in Las Vegas with the 7 basin states. We are looking at some really dire hydrology in that basin. And just to note what it says here on this particular side, the water supply that comes and augments our Middle Rio Grande supply through the San Juan Chama water is going to be affected by shortages on that system. And that provides water for tribal uses and non-tribal uses, water for Albuquerque, Santa Fe, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, the Middle Rio Grande Pueblos. It's a big deal. We need a collaborative solution with the upper basin states and the lower basin states, and it's taken a lot of time. So Sam, with that, I'll finish. I'll stop there. There's so much to talk about. I hope it gives you a flavor of what we're trying to do and the needs for the state of New Mexico and how important our water is and how important this conference is, just based on getting the word out and the message. So I really appreciate the time, and I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you ever so much for your extremely informative presentation. Really appreciate it. We're just going to move right along. Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry about that. It's my honor to introduce our next session. At last year's annual conference and earlier this spring, it's been an important initiative for the Water Institute to hold tribal engagement events and sessions throughout other NMWRRI events. And so I'm really pleased to have here a group of presenters who are going to be sharing some of their thoughts and their expertise on this topic of water resiliency for tribes, pueblos, and nations within New Mexico. As you may have heard, the ISC Director Rolf Schmidt-Peterson mentioned yesterday, there will be a component of tribal engagement for the 50-year water plan that they're working on. And so we're going to hear about that first with our first presenter, Lori Wiaki. And then we'll also be hearing more on the challenges and opportunities and resources that are available to tribal nations in terms of adaptation and mitigation resources for climate change, climate and water impacts. So with that, we'll get into our first presentation, and I'd like to introduce Lori Wiaki. Lori began her career as a community organizer on land, water, and human rights issues with the Tonantzin Land Institute. Following her father's work, she later helped lead efforts to protect the Petroglyph National Monument, a Native American sacred site, from rampant growth and road development. She's the former executive director for the Native American Voters Alliance and their 501c4 sister organization, New Mexico Native Vote. Ms. Wiaki was honored to serve the All Pueblo Council of Governors as a legislative committee member for 5 years. And she's currently consulting with the New Mexico Indian Affairs Department to ensure tribal input into the 50-year water plan. Lori is Diné, Cochiti, and Zuni Pueblo. So Lori, welcome to the conference, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to say good morning to everybody, and I want to express my appreciation for the chance to give just like a quick update on some of the work that we're doing. So I was hired as a consultant with the New Mexico Indian Affairs Department, and I just lost my notes here, but I just wanted to explain that one of our main strategies that we've been working on has been to create a tribal water work group. And the idea behind this water work group is to make sure that we're organizing ourselves to be able to give adequate input into the 50-year water plan. So that we meet monthly. The work group is made up of tribal designees, along with all the different tribal water experts and resource people that serve in the different tribal communities across New Mexico. And so what we're doing is we're really trying to build an analysis of the resilience tools that are being presented through the 50-year water plan, and really looking at these tools from a tribal perspective. And, you know, as it's been said by Indigenous people from the beginning, that water is life, right? It's everywhere. It's what makes our home, our earth, a livable place to be and to create and have our lives, you know, as human beings. And so a main point that is starting to emerge is that we should not continue to deal with water in separate sectors, right? And so on one hand, we understand that it's important and it's helpful to sort of discern the different sectors of water, but we also really recognize and are trying to figure out the best way to assert, once again, kind of the Indigenous people's perspective, the tribal perspective, that water is interconnected, and that if you take from one area and give all the water to one community or one sector, it will eventually impact other sectors. And I think that's one of the big lessons that we're learning about climate change. We just believe it's important that we begin to recognize the overlap of how, since water is interconnected, how do we really improve the water policies in which to deal with climate change? There are so many policies and potential recommendations that are beginning to sort of flower through the discussions that we've been having at the Tribal Water Work Group. But we're still in the process of better understanding what tools each tribe has in place. So we're trying to figure out, like, how many tribes have their own drought management plan? Is that the same thing as a climate change plan? So we're really spending some time talking and learning from one another about what we have in place. And, it's been said or brought up within the Tribal Water Work Group that, some tribes have, a big boat. It was kind of a joke, but we have this big boat in which to deal with the water issues, right? Other tribes really don't have a lot of resources, or they don't have a lot of access to resources in which to deal with climate change. And so we're really looking at kind of the capacity that we are both have and need to develop, and that we're lacking. So it's really important, for us to begin to have these conversations via the Tribal Water Work Group. And, I think it's important also when we think about the fact that this country is starting to recognize our faltering infrastructure. And so, we're crossing our fingers, along with many other communities across this nation, that there will be additional resources in which to deal with water infrastructure projects. A deep concern that we have heard and people are talking about is, if we got these large influxes of federal dollars and federal resources, but we were not really able to increase our capacity to manage water better, to really build for the future, and not just like build a water project that is going to be not useful, I guess, in the future, or that, we need to make sure that we're keeping up with those best practices and those best tools moving forward. But also we really need to be thinking about our universities, our community, our tribal colleges. How are they also being included in this idea of increasing capacity to generate those skills to deal with the climate change that will be happening here in New Mexico? And so, just to say that tribal communities have been able to make a life from this beautiful arid desert land. But, there's an immense amount of carbon that we are now dealing with, the large amount of extractive industries that are largely coming out of tribal lands are something new that our ancestors maybe did not deal with in the same way that our future generations will have to be dealing with these issues. And so with all that said, we are still deeply committed and believe strongly in the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous science, which still holds true. And that is that we are interconnected, that water is life, and that we really need to be paying attention what happens in Colorado, what happens in Texas, it all affects one community to the next. And so with that, I just want to end on the note to encourage us all to continue to try to build capacity together. Like, we really need to be thinking collectively about how we're building our capacity. Just listening to State Engineer DeAntonio's presentation, where he's talking about the ability to hire, I think it was 72 new people or something like that, is really critically important, and recognizing that we need to be doing those types of hires from our communities, from our tribal communities. One of the things that was really kind of hit home at the Tribal Water Work Group is just the amount of expertise that exists within tribal communities. And we're starting to have a lot of younger people that are really learning the sciences, but also deeply, deeply invested in our heritage languages, in how we have done things, for hundreds of years, and how we have survived and built a beautiful life for ourselves today and going into the future. And so, we just really need to continue to look at how are we looking that if the problems are interconnected, then the solutions also must be interconnected. We really need to look for ways that we're looking at multiple solutions, and not just from one particular sector. We need to be able to broaden our view and how we are going to manage climate change here in New Mexico. And, just to say then, the last thing is that, tribal communities, one of the things that has really come out is, there continues to be this tension, and a lot of times tribal communities really don't feel included in a lot of the discussions that are being had regarding water, regarding climate change. And so, I just want to remind, I know there's, maybe legislators, there's, department heads, there's just a lot of different people that have that ability to make decisions, to really kind of consider who are our neighbors, who are our co-regulators, who are our partners, that we should be seeking to, one, discuss the problems together, but also to discuss those solutions. And so we just really feel like it's important to continue to do state tribal collaborations. At the legislature, sometimes a legislator will get a great idea and start running with it without really checking in with the Native communities here in New Mexico. And a lot of times, so I just want to encourage all the department heads to also let your legislators and folks know that they should also be checking in with tribal communities. I've seen on a variety of levels where a good idea starts out, but because we are not inclusive of everyone, we end up really sort of shooting ourselves in the foot, because then suddenly people don't really trust one another and they don't really want to engage with one another. And so I just want to again encourage us to think about how we are making sure we're moving forward in a collective way. And so I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. And I promised I would try to keep my comments short. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Lori. I want to see if there's if anybody has any questions for Lori. Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can place some questions in the chat as well. Okay. Well, I want to say thank you again, Lori, so much. If anyone does have any questions after this, again, feel free to use the chat to reach out and keep the conversation going. And with that, I think we'll go to our next presenter, which will be Shalene Chavarria. Shalene Chavarria is a hydrologist at the U.S. Geological Survey, the New Mexico Water Science Center, where she's worked for over 10 years. In her time at the USGS, Shalene is primarily focused on analysis of the impacts of drought and climate change on water resources in the state. In addition, she also assists in tribal outreach and helps to develop technical trainings with the goal of helping to build tribal capacity in the areas of water resource management. So Shalene, very happy to have you on our session today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Tamu. Good morning to all in the Tewa language, and thank you for having me. Today I'll be sharing a little bit about some of the capabilities that the New Mexico Water Science Center has to support tribes in their climate adaptation planning. So this session is titled Water Resiliency for Tribes, Pueblos, and Nations within New Mexico. And I just pulled a very basic definition of what resilience is, an easy to understand definition. And it's the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events, trends, or disturbances related to climate. So one way to be resilient is to be prepared by having a plan for the different types of changes that might occur as a result of climate change. And I just want to acknowledge that Native American people have always been resilient. We've endured past changes in climate, among other things. And the biggest difference between now and then is that we no longer have the ability to move around freely, meaning that we're confined to reservations. So in my opinion, planning is more important than ever now. In the case of climate change and water resources, climate adaptation planning is one way to prepare for what might come. A lot of the literature on climate adaptation planning often emphasizes 3 main steps, which are all updated, throughout the lifetime of the plan. And those steps include planning, implementation of the plan, and observation. So I've tried to fit what we do at the New Mexico Water Science Center into that model. And that's what I'm showing on the screen now. So at the very top of the diagram is the planning phase. And in that I have models. So models or model output are frequently used to aid in the climate planning efforts. There's many different types of models and model output that can be used. And the USGS can assist in the planning phase by either building hydrologic models, assisting in the model building through collaborative studies, or through training on how to run a model and how to use model output data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slides. So in the implementation phase, I have support in building tribal capacity and planning, and then I have planning, monitoring, and analysis. So the USGS is not a land management agency, but we can help to show tribes how to obtain the data that they need for planning efforts, how to do different types of analysis on the data, and how to identify areas that might be vulnerable to climate change as it relates to like water quality or water quantity, either through training or collaborative studies. And I have training and collaborative studies on the arrows going back and forth. So we can do training on all of this, or we can do studies on all of this. When it comes to monitoring and data collection in the observation phase, we can help to install monitoring equipment. We could do the monitoring and put that data in our databases and do the quality assurance checks on that. Or we can train people to use the different type of equipment, to install monitoring equipment, and to do the quality assurance checks on their data. So if in the case of the New Mexico Water Science Center, we do hydrologic monitoring, but if there's a need for other types of monitoring, such as vegetation monitoring or species monitoring, we do have, we can bring in those types of expertise from across our agency. So getting back to using hydrologic models in the climate adaptation planning phase, what we've done at the New Mexico Water Science Center in some of our studies is we've used climate projections as input to surface water models in order to get stream flow projections. And we've done this for the Rio Grande Basin, and we're working on doing this for other basins. But we could also do this with the groundwater model, or we could do it with an integrated model, which is an integrated hydrologic model, which is a coupled groundwater surface water model. And we can get a bunch of different type of information out of the models, and some of the things that we can look at with model output include stream flow, evapotranspiration, soil moisture, groundwater recharge. And we could look at how this stuff is changing with different climate scenarios. So in addition to getting at how the hydrology might change in an area with future changes in like temperature or precipitation, we can also use the model to look at the hydrologic response to different management alternatives. So we can change model parameters like the amount of vegetative cover that's in an area. Say if a forest management plan is implemented, or there's changes in land use, and we can see what the hydrologic response might be. So the information that we can get from a model can be used also in water availability assessments. So we can use this to identify places where streams or springs might go dry in the future, or to identify areas where an adaptation plan might need to be implemented and where monitoring might be needed. And then we could also use the model to identify areas that might be vulnerable to flooding under different scenarios, which can help in infrastructure design. So the type of information that you could get from a model is going to be dependent on the needs of a tribe and what's important to them. So for example, it could be planning as it relates to cultural resources. So culturally significant plants, animals, or water sources like springs. But ultimately, when using the climate projections or hydrologic model projections, it's important to know that the model is only a tool, and it can help in planning efforts, but the information that you get from the model is not absolute. So there's also a lot of other things that you have to consider when you're using a model or model output, and that's like knowing the strengths and weaknesses of a model. So in some areas, the model might perform better than in other areas. Knowing the quality and quantity of the data that's used to build and to calibrate the model. And then also knowing that more complex models don't always outperform simple models. So these are just some of the things that USGS can help with. Building models for hydrologic projections through collaborative studies, or helping to understand how hydrologic models work, how to use climate projections with models that are already available, or how to do different types of analysis on the data that's coming out of the models through different types of training. So this is all part of the tribal capacity building that we try to aim for at the New Mexico Water Science Center. And then I talked about the different ways that the USGS can assist tribes through collaborative studies, but it's important to note that in the studies that if a tribe does a study with the USGS is required to publish that data. So any data that we collect, we're required to publish that data. And I also mentioned training here because I know that there's some tribes that don't want their data publicly available for many different reasons. And we respect that, that point of view, but that doesn't mean that we still can't help. So we can do different types of training that are not on tribal land, and we can use data that's already available to demonstrate the different types of analyses that the tribes could use in looking at data. So here I have a list of the different types of trainings that we've done in the past, and then a few of the studies that we're currently doing with, well, the studies that I'm involved in that we're currently doing with tribes in the state. So we've done some trainings on groundwater and surface water field methods. So showing people how to take stream flow measurements or doing channel surveying, and then how to collect water quality data or process water quality data, and then looking at hydrologic data processing. We've also done introductory training to groundwater and surface water models. This was last year, and it was an online training, so it was a little bit short, and we went through it pretty fast. But we hope to do something that's more in depth and where we can get together in person and really focus on some of the different things that people can learn with the models. And then a couple of the studies that we're doing a study, the tracking of source metals to the San Juan River. We're working with the Navajo Nation, and this is really a two-part. It's a study and it's training. So we're working with two men from the Navajo Nation, Steve and Fred, and we're showing them how to. And here's one of the pictures in the slide. It's the middle picture. We're showing them how to install the equipment that we're going to be using for monitoring. And then we also have showed them how to collect all of the data and stuff like that. So they really help us when, we can't always get out to the Navajo Nation to collect this data. They help us in the data collection efforts. And it's really been a big help. But, and then we're doing also a water resource assessment for the Rio San Jose Basin. And this one's a modeling assessment where we'll be doing stream flow projections in the next phase of the study. So those are just a couple of the studies that we've been working on, but really each tribe has their different experts and their different needs and their natural resources and environmental departments. So when it comes to trainings and studies, we need to know what types of help that the tribes need. And it needs to be, a two-way dialogue. We could say this is the type of information that we can provide, but we need to know too, what kind of information do you guys need? So that way we could find, if we don't have the expertise, we can find the experts to help you. But we can also help to identify funding sources if you need different types of trainings, or if you want to do different types of projects. And then when it comes to monitoring and data collection, I just have a couple of bullet points talking about the different types of monitoring that we can do at the New Mexico Water Science Center. So we have stream flow and groundwater monitoring either through our stream gauge network or our groundwater network, or through repeated measurements, just going out in the field and taking these measurements. And then we have water quality monitoring, either using different types of equipment or taking measurements manually once again. And all of the data that we currently collect for groundwater, surface water, water quality is on the National Water Information System. And there's a link at the bottom. You guys can check it out. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us. But we also use different types of climate parameters in our model. So we have different sources for historical climate data, and then different sources for where we get climate projections. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, we can show you that type of stuff. And then we have some scientists in the office who are working on quantifying forest disturbance, both through using satellite data and on the ground monitoring, and then expertise in sediment. So looking at changes in sediment loads. But monitoring is extremely important, monitoring and data collection, because all of this information feeds back into the models that we use for planning. So this, as I said, planning using USGS hydrologic models, implementation, helping to build the tribal capacity to use models and collect data, and then observation, also helping in the monitoring and data collection efforts. So that's all I have for now, but I've also listed some contacts that at the USGS, you can reach out to us if you have any questions or you want to know a little bit more about what we do. You can reach out to any one of us and we'll help you answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Shalene. I'd like to open it up to our audience for questions. Anyone who would like to unmute their microphone or pose a question in the meeting chat. Last call for anyone who would like to speak up before we move on to our next presenter. Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, Shalene, for your presentation and your participation today. With that, move on to our final presenter of this session. And so I'd like to introduce Cynthia Naha. She's an enrolled member of the Hopi tribe and is Tiwa and Ayangtanuan, Dakota Oyate. She's currently the New Mexico Tribal Liaison for the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as South Central CASC. Prior to working for the South Central CASC, Cynthia has close to 20 years of tribal environmental and natural resources management experience. And prior to her position at the CASC, she was the Director of Natural Resources for the Santo Domingo Pueblo, in which she oversaw water resources programs for the Pueblo and learned about the many aspects of water management here in New Mexico. Cynthia also has experience in planning for hazardous fuel reduction, forest stands development, drought resilience, watershed assessments, non-point source pollution management, environmental monitoring, waste reduction, and more. So Cynthia, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session today. Just want to make sure that I can pull up your presentation.
Okay, and if you can, I have my slides up ready on my side as well. So I'll just go ahead and jump in while Mark's pulling up my slides. But good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to be here today to present at the Water Resources Research Institute's 66th Annual New Mexico Water Conference. Before I actually jump into my presentation with the South Central CASC, which is actually an introduction, and it's going to be a real short one given that the time frame in which we have here today to present. So one of the things that I'd like to kind of hit on prior to that presentation is my past experience or my previous experience, working with Santo Domingo Pueblo as a water resources manager. Oftentimes, and not just within the water resources realm, but even within climate adaptation planning, given that the Pueblo did have a adaptation grant that was funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But one of the things that I think about is, as we talk about what does water resiliency mean, and knowing that, from an indigenous perspective, whichever tribe, Pueblo, or nation you come from, as was mentioned by Lori, water is life, and knowing that in itself, and how do we really manage for water availability as well as scarcity in the 21st century, and especially understanding the current climate conditions that we're facing at this point in time. I know yesterday they showed a bunch of the projections, they showed the drought index, they talked a lot about research and really how to use that research in science to enable our ability to become more adaptable or more resilient within the effects of climate change, and not just as the climate is changing, but as we're experiencing catastrophic wildfires, as we're experiencing drought, even severe flooding from monsoonal events, and even beyond that. And really, how does that enable not just the nation or your respective state or community to really plan for adaptation, but really what does that mean for tribes, nations, and pueblos as we begin to delve into that aspect of planning for adaptation? When I first started with the grant that we received, or that the Pueblo had received at the time, it was really frustrating because there's a lot of scientific terminology that goes behind climate change. And how do you, as a technical staff of your tribe, Pueblo, or nation, take that information and, so to speak, if you will, for the lack of a better word, downscale it to best fit the needs of your community, and most importantly, how you are planning for that adaptation. So as I experienced across the board is really beginning to look at it from that perspective, from within our communities out. Yeah, they have the global climate models. I believe we're on CMIP 6 is what was referenced yesterday, as well as CMIP 5. And I myself am no climatologist, but I'm learning about more and more about what all of this means. And most importantly, how I'm able to, so to speak, regurgitate this information so it makes sense to, say, tribal leaders here in New Mexico as they oversee their pueblos, as they oversee their tribal nations. Really, again, how do we enable our own ability from within our communities out to plan for adaptation, to continue to be the resilient communities that we are, but also knowing that climate change knows no boundaries. We understand the implications of drought and seeing the projections and understanding how irrigation works within the state of New Mexico, and even going to those prior and paramount water rights, and the importance of understanding that prior to Spanish colonial rule, there was a really high revered form of Pueblo agriculture and use of the water. So how do we ensure that that information is still upheld within the dialogue that we have today, and making sure that, when it comes to water access, that we know how it is, so to speak, shared amongst each other in the state, including Texas. So as I continue to look at these processes for not only engagement as a water resources manager, but most importantly, understanding the information that was being shared. You see a lot of the hydrologic graphs that have been presented yesterday or within different contexts, but like I mentioned, I'm not a hydrologist either, so I look at the graphs and often wonder, well, what does this mean to me? And most importantly, how do I convey the information of evapotranspiration in our reservoir to the leadership, so that way they better understand how to manage for their water as it's coming down the Rio Grande, filtering through the Middle Rio Grande Conservation District and into the Indian ditches to feed agricultural lands. So looking at it from that perspective, it's important, I think, to understand how do we really create processes for not just participation, but for, so to speak, dialogue and discussion when it comes to the management of our water resources here within the state of New Mexico. And how do we actually create a collaborative space that is just, that is equitable, that is diverse, and most importantly, has that inclusivity of people all across the states, whether you're a municipality, whether you're a county, whether you're a tribe, pueblo, or nation, how do we really create these opportunities that are allowing for us to sit at the table together to be able to better understand collectively to manage our water, and then most importantly, respecting those prior and paramount water rights that are here and are going to be here for quite some time. So as we move forward, I think with the continuation of this planning for our water resources, I really do hope that there is opportunities for those pueblos and tribes and nations to be at the table, you know, there with John Antonio and the Interstate Stream Commission to be able to weigh in, even through this tribal working group for the 50-year water plan, and making sure that those voices aren't just captured, but that they're heard and listened to. The other thing that I want to kind of touch on, you know, as far as just things that I've done, you know, I currently oversee a ad hoc committee called the New Mexico Tribal Resiliency Action Network. And so one of the things that we were fortunate enough to have happen to us as a collaboration with the 8 Northern Indian Pueblos Council is that we were awarded a Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resiliency Program grant for Category 1 to begin doing adaptation planning across the board with tribes, pueblos, and nations here in New Mexico. But our focus of that is going to be a Southwest Tribal Adaptation Menu. And I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the Great Lakes Indian Fisheries Commission, which is out of course, the Great Lakes, but they have what's called their tribal adaptation menu. So we're really trying to, sort of speak, create something similar to that, but of course not similar, because the Great Lakes is totally different from the Southwest, but creating really an opportunity for our pueblos and tribes and nations to better understand the science that is coming out from these researchers at the university level, and what it means to really integrate not just the science, but the data into your adaptation plans. And I think it should be more than just a focus on an adaptation plan specifically, but adaptation planning should be done across the board, whether you have a wildlife management plan, whether you have a rangeland management plan, a drought contingency plan, even a solid waste management plan. I think you should really look at how you can integrate adaptation into these plans versus creating a whole nother plan specific to adaptation. And of course, it'll outline your vulnerabilities and rank your priorities. But again, I think it's imperative to start looking across the board versus creating one plan that fits all, because we know not just within tribal communities, pueblos, and nations, one plan does not fit all. So I think it's important to really look at the dynamics and diversity in which you yourselves can create as far as your adaptation planning is concerned. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and, Mark, if you can bring up my presentation, I'm going to roll into my current position and kind of give an idea as to what I do now as the New Mexico Tribal Liaison and Science Communication Specialist. And sort of speak, you know, we have what's called these community of practice groups, you know, and it's been interesting sitting in them because, one, I come from a community of practice. So when we talk about actionable science or co-production of science, what does that mean to really integrate or to bring in tribal scientists, and not just tribal scientists that are at that academic level, but even our technical staff who are scientists in themselves, and beyond that to our cultural resources managers, and really trying to, sort of speak, validate that indigenous science that, you know, everybody's so wanting to put into their plans without really having, I guess, sort of speak, if you will, the respect for where it comes from and how it's used. I think that's an important aspect to really understand when it comes to actionable and co-production of science and research, especially as it relates to climate change, and utilizing that information to really enable our pueblos, tribes, and nations to continue to be adaptable, to continue to be resilient, to understand how the actions and strategies for adaptation that they're creating is really building an opportunity for them to sort of speak, develop a way to build that capacity across the board. So that way, when it comes to catastrophic wildfires, you know, we're not feeling the implications because we don't know how to go into our forests and do thinning projects or do removal of dead and diseased trees, or even taking another step forward as far as reciprocity is concerned and giving back by doing restoration projects and planting those key species that we know can thrive and survive in those areas if we understand science and where the elevation will enable them to be more successful. So with that being said, I'm gonna roll into, it's just a real quick introduction. I wanted to ensure that I didn't take up too much time and saved enough time. So Mark, if you'll go to the next slide. So, and bear with me because I have only been in my position for 4.5 months. So I'm still learning, not just my role as a tribal liaison, but more about, really what the South Central CAS does and how in my position, I can help tribes, pueblos, and nations. So, right now there are 9 different, the slide, I guess, if you're looking at the screen to your left, it shows the different casks in the area. And I apologize for the photos. I was trying to make it short, simple, and sweet to run through as much information and content as I could. So there's 9 different casks right now. And then on the opposite side shows the South Central cask and our consortium members. So we are, it's real interesting, the setup of how the cask works. We are hosted out of Oklahoma University. So I am a University of Oklahoma employee. I'm not sure if I could say go Sooners just yet, because I'm not right there yet. So with that being said, we have Louisiana State, we have Oklahoma State University, we have Texas Tech University, and the University of New Mexico. So once my office space is ready, I'll be telecommuting from my home out here in Santa Fe to UNM, in which I hope to start engaging more with the principal investigators that are there and really looking at different opportunities. But the mission of the CASC is to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to climate change. And so that's our primary focus, as well as working with natural resources and cultural resources managers. Next slide, Mark. So as part of my job, we did hear from Shailene earlier from the USGS. So the casks are actually a part of the Department of Interior, which are overseen by the USGS Geological Survey. So it's really interesting how that dynamic puts together. But one of the awesome things about that is that we do fund projects. The USGS side has projects that they do fund that is all based on research and enables the different consortium members through their principal investigators to create these proposals based on research to help fish, wildlife, natural resources managers to adapt to climate change. So with that, they're able to partner in different capacities to put together some opportunities to be able to look at perhaps maybe like a culturally significant plant, and it doesn't have to be culturally significant, or maybe just a certain species of plants that you'd like to have more of an understanding of or do a literature review on. So that way, when you go towards your adaptation goals, and if this is a key species that you want to ensure that you're planning for its adaptation because of the state of its vulnerability, in say during the summer months when we experience those increased temperatures, then it kind of helps you build perhaps maybe a database for what you want to do to enable your community to be able to do preservation or protection of that specific species. We also do education and training and technical assistance. So right now, the South Central CASC, our focus is Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. So that's the region that we primarily work in. And it's not to say that we only work in that region, because we are trying to do more cross-CASC type of engagement, especially through our tribal engagement program. Next slide. So one of the things that outreach to an approach to the research is, again, assisting those resource managers in integrating the climate data. That's one of the most, I guess, important or crucial steps as far as my position is concerned, is really ensuring that, we have the researchers, we have the postdocs, the PhDs that are all here doing the data collection, running the models, providing the information. So for me, it's like, well, how do I take that information and put it into an adaptation plan or an existing plan that I'm trying to work in, and really making the science make sense. So that's where I'm hoping in my position to be able to bridge those gaps. So that way, as Shailene mentioned, if there's certain data and information that tribes need, that we're able to provide that information to them, whether it's downscaling some of the climate projections where it's more specific to New Mexico, then that's some work that Dr. Wooten can do or Dr. Rosenthal can do. So again, there's just different opportunities they feel that tribes, pueblos, and nations could engage in. It's just a matter of beginning those conversations and figuring out an approach to it. And then again, going back to if there's an opportunity to apply for funding, then working with the principal investigator at UNM, Texas Tech, LSU, to be able to submit that. And even Choctaw and Cherokee Nation, or Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation, are two sovereign nations that are consortium members of the South Central CASC. And from my understanding, they're the only two sovereign nations within the greater CASC that are a part of a consortium. So again, a lot of the funded research projects, they include communications plans, data plans, so that way we know how the researcher will collect the information and how it will be utilized. And an interesting fun fact of my job is I now oversee the USGS Cultural Resources Subcommittee, so I'm a part a lot of reviewing these research proposals that come in and providing the suggestion to my boss on the USGS side, who's Mike Langston, about which projects to fund. Next slide. And I do apologize. I do know that this presentation is somewhat short and straight to the point, and looks like this slide's all off, but we are available, as the Tribal Engagement Program, to bring more opportunities to provide a more thorough, in-depth presentation to you. But just because of time, I just shortened it really quick. So our position as tribal liaisons, I'm specific to New Mexico. My coworker, April Taylor, who's actually been with the South Central CASC since its inception in 2012, and she's actually the original tribal liaison. She's a Chickasaw member, and she's based out of Oklahoma University. And then we have Yvette Wiley, who's Muskogee Creek, and she's an assistant to us as tribal liaisons and helps with some of our logistics when it comes to planning. But one of our positions as the tribal liaisons, of course, is to build and facilitate those relationships between the tribes and the center and the researchers, matchmaking them if there's a project that tribes have in mind, even if it's around water resiliency or building your capacity for understanding water management, then we can help you connect to a researcher at one of the consortiums and figure out what a potential project could be, and then hopefully get it funded so that way we can begin to collect that information. We aid in the translation and communication of climate science to tribal staff. And I know, oftentimes, again, you see these projections and we have so much turnover within our tribes, pueblos, and nations that, somebody might pick up an effort and then they're no longer in the position, and you get a new person coming in who doesn't have a background or understanding with climate change and all the information that goes with it. So we provide our support in that way as well as doing capacity for trainings, vulnerability assessments, and down to that adaptation planning. Next slide, Mark. So real quick. So this is one of our real specific programs that April and myself work on. Since we are tribal liaisons, we do, so to speak, or we do promote the tribal engagement strategy. There is a book that the USGS has, and I believe you can find it online and download it, but it speaks about what our tribal engagement program is. Again, working with, meeting with tribal staff, tribal technical staff to do outreach and to do introductory meetings on climate change, climate science, working with tribal youth programs to bring our tribal youth activities to their communities. And I'm trying to build up mine because right now everything's back at Oklahoma University. And if your tribe, pueblo, or nation is interested in having any of these activities come to your summer camps or anything like that, just let me know and I'll put my information in the chat, and then just reach out to me and we can definitely coordinate that. Again, building tribal staff capacity for climate related needs, understanding that science, looking at how we can ensure that as researchers are approaching their projects or their proposals, and if they're having tribes be involved or engaged in the project, ensuring that it's ethical. I know when I started, again, really trying to understand what that means, and knowing that for us as tribes, when researchers come into our communities, they often just take, and sometimes it's not done in the most respectful manner. So we want to ensure that as researchers are approaching tribes to work with them on their projects, that they're coming from that ethical standpoint. And most importantly, learning how to build those respectable relationships. Co-production of knowledge, co-production of science. So that I'm still learning more about, but again, as communities of practice and as part of a nation native building concept, if we're looking at co-production, or if we're looking at, if we're looking at developing these policies or changing legislation to be more inclusive with tribes, pueblos, and nations, then I think it's imperative to have tribes, nations, and pueblos at the seat to help create and develop these policies that will be implemented or enacted within their communities, versus having it being done from them by outside entities, because that's something that we've experienced for generations, if you understand federal Indian law and policy. So I think it's important to really look at concepts of Native nation building and how tribes, pueblos, and nations can really integrate that into the work that we're doing, and to begin to create those standards by us, for us, to be implemented by us. And then again, independent, just looking at those climate projects and how do we really implement climate science into adaptation planning for tribes. Next slide. So just a few things as far as our engagement roles. I believe I mentioned most of this. Another thing we do is mentor Native students. I believe we have 7 of them right now, and really looking at, if there's resources out there. I think we're, just collection of what the tools are, what the modeling means, and all that stuff. So really trying to help and better understanding how to utilize all this information as a tribal technical staff for your adaptation planning purposes. Next slide. So this is real quick just to show you what the tribal engagement arm looks like. Like I mentioned, there's myself in New Mexico, April oversees Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and Yvette's logistics. So the workforce development is really where we work with Native youth outreach. We do participate in the Native American Climate Youth Adaptation Leadership Congress, NICAL. We've been having meetings recently, as well as mentoring Native students. I myself have a BIA's pathway intern who's actually based out of UNM. And then one of our main focuses is building capacity, and that's bringing not just trainings and workshops to tribes and pueblos, or creating and developing them for them, but again, also providing the information for you all to understand. And then again, going to the research, really looking and ensuring that as these research projects or proposals are being developed, and especially if they plan to do research on behalf of a tribe, pueblo, or nation, that they're actually being inclusive of that tribe, pueblo, and nation, and that it's not just, doing it for them, but doing it with them on behalf, kind of, so to speak, collaboratively. Next slide, Mark. So I'm gonna kind of speed up because I'm not really sure exactly how much time we have left, and I want to be respectful of the rest of the time we have here today. So kind of just to show you a little training example, this was the Climate 101 training that was held in 2016 at Jemez Pueblo. My position has experienced some turnover over the past couple years. So I understand that not a whole lot has really transpired here in New Mexico, but I'm definitely hoping we can change that and begin to plan and coordinate more opportunities for the Pueblos, tribes, and nations. But this specific meeting was focused on water and climate change, and it was a basic introduction of climate projections, weather versus climate, and more. And out of this actual Climate 101 training, evolved the New Mexico Tribal Resiliency Action Network. And basically what we felt is, how could we as NMTRAN take all the scientific data and us as technical staff to help better communicate it within our tribal communities? Because, there's, how do you really take science terminology and translate it into Keres or into Tewa or into a way where your elders can understand or your leaders can understand? So I think it's important with our approach is ensuring that when it comes to communicating climate change, that we really put it in a perspective where it's real world and people that see and feel these changes can relate it to what's transpiring with as far as the science is concerned, these projections, seeing the changes or changes in our, say, monsoonal event, it being one more severe from one year to the next, or even understanding evapotranspiration at our reservoirs and stuff like that. So again, I think that's an important aspect. Next slide. So real quick, just to give you an idea, we do have a few workshops that are coming up. Currently, I'm trying to plan for a tribal rangeland management and climate adaptation series, focusing again on utilizing science to help understand rangeland management, when it comes to soil conditions and, things of that nature. We'll also be focusing fire and cultural burning, and then our water quality and hazardous algal blooms coming next year. So this is part of some of the things that we work on as far as the CASC is concerned, and really trying to meet the needs of the tribes, the pueblos and nations. And, I know for me, coming from a director position with the Pueblo here in New Mexico and understanding some of the current conditions, I'm able to weigh in to a degree as far as my understanding of what some of these needs are and how to better plan for it, and not just better plan for it, but really integrating that science into the work that we do in a manner where it is respectful, because we don't want to, again, just be so forceful with science and say you got to use it, when at the same time, I think we should also be validating that indigenous science or indigenous knowledge as well. Next slide. So just real quick, just to kind of give you an idea, and I could put that link in the chat if anybody's interested, or you can reach out with me. But again, when it comes to these research projects, my experience with it thus far is I've seen where and how tribes can be a part of these proposals, and utilizing this opportunity for research to perhaps do a literature review or to do something more in depth to help you get to that point of data collection to better understand maybe your forest health, maybe your rangelands, maybe water quality, just things like that. So there's different processes in how this has been done, and different, again, proposals that have been submitted in those capacities, but it is specific in how this really works with the South Central CASC. I mean, especially with this USGS funding, and I'm learning more and more about it, where our consortium members and those principal investigators are the ones that are eligible to apply for this funding. There's a competitive funding, so they're allowed to apply for that. And then ensuring that how they work with tribes, I think, is an important part of who we are, and making sure that we're doing that matchmaking. So that way, if there is a project in and around a tribal community, that they're making those steps and those efforts to reach out, to be inclusive with their research, and ensuring that if research is focused on something specific to maybe what the tribal needs are, that engagement is there. Next slide. So this is just an example of a past project to give you guys an idea as to what was done. As mentioned, the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nations are a part of the consortium members, so they are eligible to apply for the USGS funding. April Taylor, who's my coworker, has a really big role in a lot of this facilitation of the research, and ensuring that, tribes are a part of any project that's coming up, or that they at least have, their way in and their foot in the door and stuff like that. So that way they're included. So with that, the last slide is basically just contact information. Again, I know this presentation was really chopped in half because I was trying to be mindful of time. At first, it was only 10 minutes and it switched. So if anybody's interested in learning more about the South Central CASC, or would like to have a conversation with myself and my colleagues out of the Tribal Engagement Program, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I've also provided the federal contact for the USGS side, both Steve Jackson and Mike Langston, as well as the OU side, Renee McPherson and Emma Custer. So if you guys are interested in learning more, perhaps having a more in-depth presentation on what the Tribal Engagement Program does, just feel free to reach out to me and we could definitely get something scheduled. But with that, I'll go ahead and end there, Mark, and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Yes, please, we'd love to hear get some questions from our attendees.
I do see a question in the CASC. It says, is it possible for other universities to explore becoming a part of the CASC consortia teams? I'm going to say yes. I do believe there is a way, and it's all about, you know, making that connections with the heads of the CASC. So you'd want to reach out to, say, Mike Langston or Renee McPherson to really have a discussion further on that. I unfortunately at this point in time don't really know how that works, given that coming into it, and we just started our 10th year as the South Central CASC. And from my understanding, you know, our consortium members right now are pretty much those ones that have been set for quite some time, but it doesn't mean that you can't become a consortium member. I will take note of that question, and I will follow up with my bosses to get more information on that. And then I could either provide it to Mark, or like I said, you guys can reach out to me, maybe shoot me an email, and from there we could go ahead and share that information. And I see Dave has a question, so Dave might actually be able to help answer that as well.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Cynthia was saying. I was the UNM PI for the UNM component of the CASC proposal before I retired. And I've been funded by the CASC to do research. So the basic ground rule is the CASC for external funding expects proposals to come in through a CASC consortium member. And so you don't necessarily need to go through the central office in Oklahoma, but you do need to collaborate with someone from a CASC consortium institution. And in New Mexico, those are UNM and the Water Science Center. So proposals coming in through that in collaboration with anybody else are welcome.
So I do see another question. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you weighing in on this. Dave's been there, of course, a consortium member for quite some time, and I've had the pleasure to meet with him during the summer. Well, miss his presence, but I know he'll still be around. So there was a question that mentioned that Katie missed the name of the network. So it's called the New Mexico Tribal Resiliency Action Network, or NMTRAN. And I don't know if I'll just go ahead and talk about it, because I was gonna say, I don't know if we have time, but I actually have, and I could probably share it with Mark, and Mark can share it with everybody. But I created a two-minute digital story on who NMTRAN is. And basically over the years, we evolved. We're an ad hoc committee comprised of technical staff. I overled it in my former position at Santo Domingo Pueblo. We had people from Laguna Pueblo, Santa Ana Pueblo. We also had UNM. The Center was a big partner of ours, Flower Hill Institute, High Watermark, the South Central CASC. So we had quite a bit of people that really pretty much came together to focus on how we could communicate climate change to our tribal communities, our Pueblo communities here in New Mexico, without having to, I guess, so to speak, be so scientific about it. Because I know for myself, it took me quite some time to really, so to speak, become comfortable in the conversation around climate change. Because again, there's so much information out there that once you start searching, I found myself falling in a rabbit hole as far as what I needed to know for my adaptation planning. So as we continue to move forward, and a part of our effort was to really work with these different organizations as technical staff and even academic institutions to learn how to better understand what these projections mean, to learn how to better understand what the scientific aspect of climate change is, and utilizing in that context to convey it to, say, ranchers and farmers within a pueblo, or to technical staff that are just now getting involved in climate change. Because I know the CASC, we have Climate 101 sessions, and they're really technical. And again, I'm not a climatologist, I'm not a hydrologist. You know, I've learned as I went what this information means, and really how to, sort of speak, spread it across the programs. In my former position, as mentioned, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but in my former position, I managed 22 different federal funds from about 5 to 6 different agencies. And as we, as I was talking about climate change, it's interesting because climate change was over here by itself, but yet we were looking at forest health. We were looking at rangeland. We're looking at agriculture, water quality and quantity, even air quality. And like I mentioned, solid waste and illegal dumping. But why are we not folding the conversation of 2-degree temperature increases into our forestry work, into our agriculture work, into our water work? Why are we not talking about the implications of wildland fires and what it means after that fire is burnt out when the monsoons come and we experience more hazards, given that the sediment is now running down into our tributaries, down into the Rio Grande, which could eventually, in some places, create more of a catastrophic effect. So I think for me, it was important to really start looking at how to be more holistic with our conversation around climate change. And through NM-TRAN, that gave us, so to speak, that ability to be able to do that. And so as mentioned, we are going to get started on our climate change, our tribal resiliency program grant, and really working towards how do we build this Southwest tribal adaptation menu. So this is, so to speak, kind of like a plug for those of you that might be interested in participating in this as we pick up our preliminary work, because one of the things is really reaching out to partners across these different agencies that are addressing climate adaptation and resiliency to have them be a part of the development of this adaptation menu. I hope that answers your question. I think it was Katie. And like I said, I'll send Mark the 2-minute digital story, and he can share it with you all. And then again, then you'll have my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me again if a tribe, pueblo, or nation is interested in having more of an in-depth tribal engagement conversation, if you're interested in research, if there's even perhaps a training or workshop that you're interested in having in your community, just reach out to me and we can definitely get something planned. All right, Mike, with that, I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much, Cynthia. And yes, I'll follow up if there's any information that you want me to provide to the attendees here today. I'd be more than happy to. And thank you again, and thank you to all of our presenters. Even though we were one presenter short from our original lineup, we still ended up right about on time here, just for a short break until we come back again at 12:15. Let me just pull up our program to share with you all. So just to give you an idea, we'll enjoy a short break now, and then we'll start things again shortly after the noon hour, hearing some presentations from WRRI staff in this project involving water data modeling and stakeholder visions for water resilience in New Mexico. So hope to see you all back here at that time. In the meantime, you can grab a little bit of an early lunch, stretch your legs, enjoy a little bit of time until we reconvene. But thank you so much for all of our morning presenters, and we'll see you back shortly. So we've hit 12:15. Hope everyone had a nice little break, maybe grabbed a quick bite to eat, or we'll have something during this noon hour lunch session. Yeah, for this session, I'd like to turn it over to the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute Director, Dr. Sam Fernald.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And brief overview of this afternoon, we'll spend time until 1:30 talking about some of the transition from thinking about the issues we've been dealing with. We had a nice session before the break talking about some of the ideas with resilience for tribes, pueblos, and nations. We'll give some examples that are research-based. And then at 1:30, we'll translate that into some participatory breakouts to get your input on ideas for resilience. So this is really to the next 5 talks are to kind of seed the discussion. And no one of them is intended to be comprehensive, but to give some ideas for resilience. So I'm going to stop the share for a second and move over to my presentation. All right, so this was put together with help from Kevin Perez and also others who are giving their own talks, so they're not listed here. And also I noticed Lily's on the list, so I hope I don't take some of her material regarding acequias. But with that said, we are working at the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute to put data together. We have our Water Data Act, sorry, and we're taking data from efforts like that and trying to translate them into usable tools. One example is the New Mexico statewide water budget that takes inputs and outputs and shows where water is at 4 different scales: the state, counties, planning regions, and basins. And you can see the hydrologic diversity of New Mexico. This example is just illustrating that for historical water use by category, looking at different counties, and the category being groundwater, there's a change in storage. This is groundwater storage. There's a change in storage that's in the southeastern part of the state that is mainly because this is fossil water that is not recharged. That's acknowledged in the water use planning for that part of the state. If you compare that, for example, you go to Socorro County, Lee County in blue, this is time from 1975 to 2020. We have ongoing depletion, but where we have a river-connected aquifer, in this case, the Rio Grande system, there's relatively stable groundwater storage over the same period when we saw depletion. So it's very important as we think about resilience to keep in mind the hydrologic backdrop. And that was also illustrated by the Leap Ahead presentations. What is the hydrologic base condition that we're working with? If we look at the future, this statewide water budget has climate models and management possibilities like agricultural crop efficiency, water use efficiency, and population growth rates. And when we look into the future, we see also illustrated by the Leap Ahead effort. Here we see in the upper right for the state of New Mexico, dark blue is the mean annual hydrograph. And in the future, in yellow and red, we see earlier runoff and less runoff. And that's notable in San Juan River Basin, for an example, with the inflows are illustrated, and we see the same pattern with less and earlier runoff, which is has important impacts downstream as surface water availability declines, groundwater pumping increases. Here's an example from Doña Ana County showing surface water and groundwater depletions for agricultural uses. And you see this point in 2011 when the system really flipped to heavy dependence on groundwater. And this actually is exacerbated. Paper in the WRRI showed that this started way back in the mid-90s. Basically, the recharge from the landscape to groundwater started statistically declining in the mid-90s. And that leads to reduced groundwater storage. Here's just an example of water levels in the lower Rio Grande. And we see them go up and down every year, and then they start dropping. And sorry, this isn't updated, but we've seen basically this same well has gone up and down at about the 20 to 25 feet below the ground surface since 2015. And looking at the big picture, in El Paso, in the Waco Bolson in brown here, we saw depletion starting in the drought of the 50s, and water levels dropped 100 feet, 50 feet below the surface and disconnected the groundwater from the river. We haven't seen that completely in the Mesilla. We've actually at a threshold condition, but we haven't seen the depletion like we've seen in the Waco Bolson. And fortunately, the Middle Rio Grande and Española Basin are relatively in balance. So what I'd like to talk about is in the northern part of New Mexico, what are some of the clues to water resilience? And we released this book of studies that took place over about 10 years or longer that showed some of the clues to resilience for Acequia country. So I'll be illustrating those just as one example when we're thinking about what is it that makes a system water resilient. And I highlighted these with clues. I've shown this presentation before, and we talked about it a little, and it just is one example. So here are some of the clues we found. The water is managed by community associations, maintain agricultural landscapes during dry times. Groundwater is not used to offset surface water shortages. Surface water and groundwater in balance, like I mentioned. Surface water irrigation recharges groundwater. Groundwater return flows maintain river flows. Acequia return flows delay river flow hydrographs. There's repartimiento, water shortages are shared, and abundance is shared. And finally, mutualism maintains these acequias. So I'll give some examples, but the point is when we have this palette of options, together these create what look like the conditions for long-term water sustainability. So let me see here. I want to go over time. So how am I doing on my time? Should I finish by 12:30, Mark, or do I have till 12:35?
I think you should have until 12:35.
Okay.
Around then, yeah.
So here's a big clue. Acequias are managed by community water associations, so the community is heavily invested in the management of the water. Another clue, acequias preserve agriculture. This is a comparison of dry and wet years. And the wet years, the system is expanded to irrigate the full landscape. In dry years, the agricultural footprint, it isn't sold off, converted, it's maintained even though it's not irrigated. Percolation below crops that recharges groundwater. So that surface irrigation is so important when it leaks into the soil and goes down to the groundwater. This just shows one irrigation season where you can see the water going below the rooting zone of the plants, and it actually hits the groundwater, and you can see a spike in groundwater, and each year the water goes up and down as it gets recharged by the surface water. This is the average plot for the Española Valley sites that we studied near Alcalde. And we have this every year. The water goes up with ditch and field seepage, and then that water goes down at the end of the season when the irrigation system is turned off. And that actually provides return flow to the river. So that groundwater is soaking back into the river, providing water for downstream use. Very important. Here's another thing, the acequias ameliorate the impacts of climate change by creating return flow to the river a month to 3 months after it's been diverted, and maintains flow in the river when people most need it. Repartimiento, water shortage and abundance are shared. Unlike senior water rights where the senior water user will get all the water, acequias have adapted to hydrologic variability by sharing that abundance and sharing the shortage. These are lessons that can be used for water management throughout New Mexico, not just in Acequia country. And community mutualism. There's such a sense of place and importance in that connection to land, water, and community that pervades all the interactions with the community and their water, so that it actually becomes a self-perpetuating mindset that creates water resilience. And we even hypothesize, this is very rudimentary, but this beyond things like our water budget, our water use, our demand gap, we need to figure out ways to document and support these important community aspects of water management. So I'm just going to end with that. We have a lot of other projects we'd like to talk about. And I'm going to stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam. Next on our list, or next kind of going down the line of presenters, we have Dr. Connie Maxwell, who's a postdoctoral researcher at NMWRRI. Connie, I see you're there. Looks good.
Yes, must unmute. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can.
Okay, terrific. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this terrific conference. One of the aspects of managing water for future resilience in New Mexico is to try to capture the stakeholder visions in different regions and their ideas for different strategies to attain that resilience. And so we are collaborating with the IC on their 50-year water plan in many ways, as you have heard in many different forums, but to also conduct a series of group conversations and focus groups around the state. And so far, we've done a first round of group conversations in the Acequia region, in the lower Rio Grande region, and in Southeast New Mexico. The team that is working on this particular project, and it's in collaboration with a few other projects, but the team that's working on this is the team that's been working on the dynamic statewide water budget model, which Sam outlined. And we have several models that are offshoots of that use that data and integrate other data, plus the researchers that are working on aspects of those particular regions. So that's Sam, who you just heard from, Kevin, who helped contribute to that presentation, Austin Hansen, previous Institute program specialist now at Interra, Dr. Saeed Langarudi, who has really spearheaded what's an offshoot model for the lower Rio Grande region, which of course also coincides with Doña Ana County. And that offshoot model uses the DSWB inputs and integrates socioeconomic factors. I have been working with Saeed on that particular model, and I've been very active down in the lower Rio Grande. And this presentation will explain our process in these different regions and our process going forward a little bit, but we'll also summarize our group conversation in the lower Rio Grande. Lily Conrad, who has been doing work in the Acequia region, and last but not least, program coordinator for this particular project, Mark Sheely. And the last three of us, myself, Lily, and Mark, have been co-facilitators in these different conversations. The goals of our group conversations are that we're framing these with a brief presentation at the beginning on what managing the water budget can mean, particularly for resilience. As Sam pointed out, a lot of the sort of aspects of that, and our focus in these groups is on the role of collaboratively developing understandings of the regional water dynamics, distilling those clues to resilience that Sam mentioned, and using our modeling in different forms with the DSWB to test what combinations of strategies can achieve the resilience visions of the regional stakeholders. This focus is what underlies our goals, which is to collect the regional perspective of what is valued about the region, what issues affect the region, strategies that can address those issues, and ultimately the visions for the future. As I mentioned, we've really just gotten started with this effort. We'll have additional focus groups with producers in many of the regions and additional larger group conversations. We'll be reviewing the results all along the way with the contributors and ultimately synthesizing the information into a Water Resources Research Institute report, which will then contribute to the ISC's 50-year water plan. We are also seeking funding to conduct assessments of these regional dynamics, to extend, and here on the right, you can see the basic structure of the offshoot model that we've built for the Lower Rio Grande region, extend those kind of offshoot models throughout the state so that we can use the power of the statewide water budget model input, but then also integrate regional issues, additional data, and particularly socioeconomic factors. And we're also seeking funding to provide support for pilot tests of some of these strategies that show promise. So here is a little bit of an intro to how we conducted a couple of these group conversations. And then following that will be the Lower Rio Grande synthesis of that conversation. And then after this, Lily will address the Acequia region and Mark will address the Southeast region. So this is the Lower Rio Grande. Once again, the Doña Ana County overlap. And you can see the overlap of the watershed of the Hatch and Mesilla valleys here. So there is actually not a too bad overlap, but of course, these different boundaries never really coincide. This particular—
strangely, I just see a map of New Mexico.
Do you see a map of New Mexico with some snow and the Rio Grande Basin?
No,
Oh.
it says team.
For some reason, it's not sharing the correct screen. There we go.
Yes.
Okay. So this was the second slide where I was talking about what is valued about the region, issues that affect the region, strategies. And now we're on to this third slide, the Lower Rio Grande. And you can see here what I was referring to, and Sam made Sam realize that I was sharing the wrong screen. The Lower Rio Grande and the water planning region coincides completely with the county. And you can see the overlay of that Huckate watershed there with the county and the imperfect overlap. This particular conversation was in collaboration with the Hatch and Mesilla Valley Watershed Planning Process, which is a project that's funded by Reclamation's Cooperative Watershed Management Program. That is an effort that is spearheaded by the South Central New Mexico Stormwater Management Coalition and partners, quite a few partners on that, including ourselves at the Institute. We are spearheading the planning component of that. This is how the presentation somewhat started for a couple of the groups. The idea really is to talk about the, here you see the natural cycle dynamics, the natural water cycle dynamics. But what does that mean for each particular region? And here you can see the lower Rio Grande watershed. Of course, reservoirs are important components. Recharge into the groundwater, groundwater pumping, evapotranspiration. On the right side, we explain this as a very simple, it's a simple version of a water budget model, and kind of explained how, with water budgets, it's much like a bank account. What you look at what goes in, what goes out, your change in storage, as Phil King described yesterday. What you see here on this very simple water budget model are results from our DSWB for this particular region. You can see very variable surface water from 1975 to 2018, which is the current amount of time that's covered by the historic aspect of that region. You can see with groundwater aquifer storage, this is actual amount of storage change, and the red line being zero change. You can see accelerating variability in that as well, and certainly declines being an issue that we're grappling with down here. So the idea with managing the water budget is, if we come up with these different strategies, and these are some that we've discussed in this region, where, for example, you capture and spread arroyo flows. That's one that we've been looking at pretty significantly down in the region. Add upper watershed restoration at recharge zones, mountain fronts, and along arroyos can contribute to that particular strategy. What if we looked at decreasing evapotranspiration through crops and efficient practices, increasing recharge through a variety of different efforts? So the concept of managing the water budget is looking at these internal dynamics and then saying, okay, what does the future hold? And looking at the water budget to predict that. So we then went into the issues, the strategies, and the visions that we could potentially test in such a model. What could possibly achieve overall visions like groundwater resilience? So starting with issues, this particular, the Hatchamasia Valley Watershed Planning process, we've been at it for several months, and the issues have been identified in previous meetings as well as synthesized in some surveys. And so these are some of the results of the surveys, which we discussed in this particular conversation. Vegetation conditions, productivity, and erosion in upper watersheds is really one of the major issues. And these issues 1 through 7 were ranked by the survey, and that came in as the top issue. We're not like many other places in the state. Much of our issue is not upper forest management. We have these extensive rangelands, which are converting from shrubs to grasslands. And so the bare ground and the erosion, here you can see a picture from the Rincon Arroyo watershed, are really our major issues. Water supply, of course, a need to increase coordination to achieve goals, soil deposited into the valley from the upper watersheds, flooding, watershed effects from urban development expansion. There's lots of developments that are very, very close to arroyo flows, and a need for coordinated watershed planning efforts in the Oregon Peaks National Monument. One of the things that, of course, was a pretty dominant dynamic this year were the floods at the end of September. In particular, this is a picture of the La Union area, and over 3 days, La Union got 6.11 inches, which was 60% of its annual up to that point, which is a remarkable number when you look at the precipitation frequency estimates. It's above a 500-year storm, and it's just shy of a 1,000-year storm, which is 6.36 inches over 3 days. So La Union figured very prominently in our discussions, but flooding in general is an issue that many have been facing in the region. The strategies that within the survey, all of the strategies that have been drafted so far were considered to either directly or indirectly benefit many of the respondents. You can see the little numbers here. These are the numbers of respondents so far. The survey's still open. 19 have responded so far that would be either directly or indirectly benefit by these strategies. Identify expansion to the early warning system. There is a fairly extensive network of weather stations and flow gauges, which both, warns of floods, but also gives us data, long-term data for the region to assess these watersheds. Produce schematic plans for watershed restoration, develop plans for adapting flood infrastructure to capture sediment and serve as water supply from the largest storms. expand the aquifer recharge network. There is some of that effort going on now, and we do have a reclamation drought response program grant to expand that network and develop a decision support tool to support that. Continue the Rincon Arroyo watershed project planning. That is a pilot project. It's a priority project for the region. It's a very large watershed in the region that deposits the highest estimated amount of sediment for the region. That decision support tool that I mentioned, planning regulation to anticipate and mitigate future development pressures, identify the critical flooding areas emanating from the new monument, and develop watershed educational and technical support programs. I will end with the visions for the future and related strategies. This is a combination of this particular event, as well as we had a master watershed conservationist and new program panel discussion on the future of this watershed. And there were some visions for the future captured there. Three main came out of this workshop. Several visions, but somewhat related. Achieve economic and community resilience integrated with ecological resilience. And in keeping with that, keep water, sediment, and nutrients on the landscape to increase infiltration, promote revegetation and other surface treatments, and reduce erosion. Instigate a crew that does continual restoration around the valley involving youth. Significantly reduced sediment transport that leads to less sediment in the flood, both the agricultural infrastructure and the flood control infrastructure, requiring less sediment removal from the river and from that infrastructure. Reduce recurring maintenance issues by building a healthy watershed that's supposed to be economically and ecologically. Build network and working groups to achieve bigger goals on the scale of the region. In keeping with that, also collaborate across agencies with existing tools. Think outside our own boxes, identify barriers, and collaborate to improve policies. Integrate community approach to address problems on watershed and regional scales. Start a well-funded campaign that equals the effort, similar to the Rio Grande Water Fund. Identify problem areas, develop a plan, measure that plan by how many issues we address, and employ adaptive management from projects. The additional visions from the panel: flood flows used by vegetation or recharging aquifers instead of evaporating or flowing downstream. The challenges of climate change and the prospect of more intense storms plus aging infrastructure provide an opportunity to rethink everything. How we deal with floods, and it's an opportunity to restore the river. Congressionally convened stakeholder process could bring together everybody to think creatively about how we fix all of these different problems in a way that provides some resiliency against climate change, protects people from flooding, meets the needs of irrigators, and restores the river and the environment generally. A lot of focus on the water infrastructure packages that are currently in Congress. Critical to addressing, these funding sources will be critical to addressing the aging infrastructure issues in the face of the sleeping giants of future monsoonal events, like the one that just occurred in La Union, which will do a lot of harm. Complementary approaches for water storage and supply to also support things like improved habitat for wildlife. That's in keeping with the idea that our watersheds are a critical part of the infrastructure of our systems. And finally, a lot can be done and needs to be done to reduce the amount and energy of floodwaters that we have by having healthy watersheds. It's going to take a mosaic of all possible approaches. And with that, I turn it over to Lily.
Okay. Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Connie, thank you for the transition. Sam, thank you for your presentation earlier in this session. My name is Lily Conrad, and I'm a master's student in NMSU's Water Science Management Program and a graduate research assistant for WRRI. Today, I will be providing a summary of the Acequia region, the Northern Rio Grande Organizational Focus Group. This is related to what Connie was explaining at the beginning of her presentation. We conducted a series of 3 focus groups so far in different regions in New Mexico. And I will be providing a little summary of the insights that we gleaned from our Acequia affiliated individuals. Oh, okay, so I have to move this. All right, here's the flyer that we used to reach individuals. So what we ended up doing was we extended an invitation to individuals who represent organizations based out of Northern New Mexico who are involved with acequias in some sort of capacity. And we asked them to share their professional or organizational perspective of the water dynamics of the Northern Rio Grande region in New Mexico. So just as a little bit of background, I included this slide so you can kind of get an idea of the people who attended this focus group. We had 10 individuals attend from a variety of affiliations. We had business owners, committee members, nonprofit representatives, board members from acequia associations and other leaders from acequia associations. We had commissioners, presidents. We had a county soil and water conservation district and scientists. Here's kind of a list of the groups that we were able to include in our conversation. So we were able to get Taos Land Trust, members from TVAA, NMAA, Rio Chama Acequia Association, Mura Regional Acequia Association, East Rio Arriba County Conservation District, and scientists from the Alcalde Sustainable Agriculture Science Center. So we were able to really reach a diverse group of professional organizations, individuals from professional organizations all around the Acequia region, and also organizations that have very different involvement surrounding acequias with what they do. Here's a little word cloud that I created from my notes of what individuals were saying they value about their involvement with acequias and what they value about acequias. This isn't from the transcript. These are just from the notes that I took, but it really helps you see where the emphasis lies in these individuals' perspectives of their relationship with acequias and water in their regions. So you can see some of the larger words are connection, lifeblood, future, and querencia. These kind of all stem from a place of connection to tradition, connection to neighbors, friends, family, thinking of the future based on, generations of experiences in these communities, generations of history in these communities, and really feeling that connection to the land and the water and community. And diving into the issues and challenges that these individuals helped us identify, I realized there are a lot of bullet points on this slide. And I tried to group them into kind of overarching themes. So the themes of environment, social themes, governance, and economic themes. So I'm not going to talk in too great of depth about all of these bullet points. I'll kind of go through them and try to explain a few things here and there. But starting with the environmental category, some of the major issues that came up, and these were individuals from many different regions within the Acequia region that were expressing these issues as things that they're concerned about with their respective acequias. So there was a lot of overlap with similar issues across different Acequia regions. So first there's a need for better irrigation and field management. There's a lot of issues regarding brome grass invasions in alfalfa and hay fields. People aren't paying as much attention with their irrigation. So acequia networks are seeing uneven water application. There's mismatched irrigation practices between ditches, between irrigating an entire field versus only part of a field. Those are some of the issues related to irrigation and field management. There's difficulty with sharing water. There's difficulty with allocating water. There are problems with invasive trees and invasive species, where invasive trees are taking up a lot of water along the banks of rivers, such as salt cedars and Russian olives. And kind of a really big problem that is kind of influencing all of these other issues is there are increasing temperatures, extreme shortages, and extreme variation. All of these communities are observing unpredictable weather and a lot of water shortages. And also wells going dry is related to that. There are problems with soil health. There are problems with forest restoration, where our watersheds are our upland watersheds are in an unhealthy state. They're too densely forested. There's the risk of fire. We're seeing a loss of water rights from acequias and being transferred to other places in the state. Some of the social concerns that came up is that there are pressures from the outside. So outside people coming in and buying land that might have been fallow and are expecting water rights. They're seeing a lack of pilot projects, public awareness campaigns, and education initiatives that would help educate community members regarding these seasonal challenges that are becoming more common. Moving into the governance theme, they're seeing a lack of good information that is informing policy. There are no water conservation regulations incorporated into building standards. They feel that political initiatives don't reflect the reality of the state. These individuals also feel that our water laws are very difficult to work with from the acequia perspective and the acequia more local community-based level. Lack of consideration of efficiency of water rights, no gap analysis. There's a need for a large regional infrastructure analysis, and just a general need for a bottom-up watershed level approach to categorizing and approaching these issues and tackling these issues. And finally, just some economic concerns is the impacts of the cash economy. It's hard for young people to stay in these communities. And there's a need for more funding and labor to get these restoration projects underway, to start restoring forests, restoring soil health, keeping community members, providing opportunities for community members to stay within the community and to propagate acequia tradition into the future. And some strategies and solutions related to those same themes. So environmental strategies and solutions to addressing the problems that were identified are starting thinning projects that are concurrently restoring soil health and soil base, re-emphasizing polyculture and perennial practices, also to maintain a healthy soil biology. It's all coming back to soil health with these solutions, maintaining intact ecosystems to improve water availability for downstream users and improve water quality. And there's a need for more protective covers for crops to protect against unpredictable weather events. I know also, kind of not related to this focus group, I heard from a lot of acequia irrigators and acequia producers that some really intense rainstorms took out cornfields this year, and it was really difficult. It happened multiple times, and it took a lot to come back from those extreme weather events. Some social solutions, really emphasizing strong, foresighted community planning, culturally relevant strategies for community engagement. And a lot of this will really lie in investing in the youth and getting the youth engaged and involved, because they are our future. And a few governance solutions, providing incentives for businesses to restore water supplies or offset their water use, or to adopt conservation practices, and creating more innovative regional modeling to more holistically inform policy, they believe will also be a solution for governance problems. And finally, some economic solutions, additional funding for community and regional science centers to conduct research and relay the findings to communities and to producers. And finally, more food processing facilities so that New Mexico can be more independent in their food production within the state. And just to wrap up, I have 2 more slides for visions to achieve in New Mexico. So kind of born out of our list of issues and solutions, our individuals helped us brainstorm visions on positive milestones to achieve in New Mexico going forward. So the first one I have here is increasing the number of farmers by 2050 to have a viable and holistic watershed in the Rio Santa Cruz watershed. So this is just one example. I'm sure there are other watersheds that would also like something similar. But this particular individual suggested reaching 5,000 acequia irrigated acres in this watershed to have more widespread recharge, to maintain a healthy stream system, and to achieve food sovereignty. And the second point here is to allow use of a portion of arroyo flows and monsoon floodwaters for productive use. This kind of gets at what Connie was mentioning with diverting floodwaters for recharge. And my last slide with 3 more visions for the future to increase the success of farmers based on management approaches from already existing successful and creative farms as a model. We do have a lot of success stories here in northern New Mexico of farmers who have economically viable operations that are always happy to impart their knowledge onto up and coming farmers or maybe struggling farmers. So to really take advantage of those connections and that knowledge. Second, to pursue large regional systems analyses of both shallow and deep aquifer systems to understand potential future developments and support larger campaigns to build public awareness and political will for a more resilient future. That's a very overarching theme in all of our sessions here in this conference. And finally, my last vision is to increase understanding of regional water and climate change dynamics through installing more spatially extensive hydrological and climatological monitoring stations and networks. And I would like to thank all of the individuals who helped contribute to these issues, the strategies, and the visions to help us get a better feel for how they perceive water in their respective acequia regions. Here is my contact information in case any of you have any follow-up questions. But other than that, that is all I have. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Lily. And I guess brings it on to me as our last presenter for.
I noticed there was a question mark.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I wanted to make sure that, yes, we get some time for questions as well. Let's see.
About cadencia, I see. Sorry, I missed that. Yes, thank you, Ralph, for bringing that up. So cadencia is a word that describes the connection that community members and individuals feel to their land and to their water. It's that sense of place. That's what is associated with that word. Hopefully that answers your question, and hopefully that helps others who maybe were unfamiliar with that term coming into this presentation.
Okay, any additional questions for Lily? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I see a question too about if this presentation is being recorded. Yes, we're recording all of our conference sessions. We'll make these recordings available through the conference website for attendees or anyone who might not have been able to attend the conference live to be able to view. I'm going to give a little summary of the third focus group conversation that we actually hosted just this past Monday. So I'll introduce myself briefly again. I suppose, although at this point you all are probably quite familiar with me, but it's a bit of an experience to sort of turn the tables and be on the presentation side for this summary. But my name is Mark Sheely. I'm a program coordinator at the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute. And my experience primarily up until now has been in helping to organize and facilitate the conferences, workshops, other events that the Institute has hosted. And so I really looked forward to this chance to sort of step into a more formal kind of facilitator role in bringing together some organizational stakeholders from the southeastern region of New Mexico to get their perspectives on the hydrological challenges, issues, values, as well as some of their visions for the future, as you've heard previously. And the process was similar to what you've heard from Lily's case, in which we reached out to a number of organizational stakeholders in the region in an attempt to get a kind of broad cross-section of interests into at least this first focus group meeting, and with the hopes as well to kind of build from this first meeting into other conversations, producer conversations, and broader conversations on the hydrological dynamics of the region and possible strategies for resilience. So just to say that because this meeting was held just this past week, and I wanted to just err on the side of caution in terms of, you know, kind of outlining the members or the participation of this focus group. And so I'll kind of with a broad brush kind of say that, you know, for this meeting this past Monday, we had the input from representatives from state and federal agencies, from the sectors of rural water interests in the area, the oil and gas industry, as well as some produced water research perspectives, as well as organizations involved with water conservation and water management in the region. So in this first slide, I start with some of the issues and challenges that were encountered, that this focus group identified. And because of the sort of unique characteristics of this region of southeastern New Mexico, where you have in the far eastern portion the reliance on groundwater resources that are fossil water resources, and then in the more western portion of this region, the Pecos watershed and that connected surface groundwater interaction, the issues and challenges, as well as you'll see some of the strategies and possible solutions can be unique depending on where specifically within that region your interests lie. So, for example, we see here some of the cases of concern about, you know, the dwindling freshwater supplies within the Ogallala Aquifer, and, you know, how that will impact, you know, local economies, local livelihoods, essentially, as those water supplies continue to diminish. As you saw from Dr. Sam Fernald's presentation earlier, with the illustration of with a lack of surface water recharge, and the mining of those fossil water resources, the continued depletion of that aquifer. So definitely something that was highlighted within this focus group as well. Also we see, though, you know, on the other hand, the look at understanding where there is that surface groundwater connection, understanding that link further to be able to take advantage of those hydrological dynamics for to build long-term water resiliency. We see here some challenges as well that are related to regulatory or policy issues. For example, we have from the oil and gas perspective, some, foreseeing a limitations to the use of fresh water for the oil and gas industry uses, and that being something that could force a sort of change in operations for that sector of the industry, as well as therefore getting oil and gas companies to adopt, say, like increased reuse of produced water over simply using groundwater along with disposal, being some of the operational challenges. And we also do have some challenges that were outlined regarding, for example, the challenges of maintaining a healthy and dynamic habitat for wildlife within the region, and tying into as Lily and Connie mentioned, some of the values. The values, some values that were outlined in this focus group involved protection of some of these species, including the Texas hornbill. So maintaining that habitat and efforts to work towards habitat restoration were brought up in this meeting. And some other unique challenges, I think, go to within agencies, the limitation of resources within state agencies for enforcement and implementation of water management aspects, and how this ties into perhaps some of the another issue that came up and was interesting to note due to the state engineer's earlier presentation talking about cannabis, seeing some concern from local water interests in the use of drinking water being used for cannabis production, not only I should say unique to this region, but as a concern sort of that this group expressed may be a statewide issue. And so from these strategies or from these challenges and issues, I think it was important then to see how those this group was able to illustrate some possible solutions, some approaches that could be used to help build resilience and address some of those issues. So practices such as being able to withdraw water from production when necessary, and then being able to put it back into production when there's times of plenty. So more dynamic use of more dynamic management in that regard. Improving irrigation, farm irrigation efficiencies, investments in things like center pivot, and transitioning away from flood irrigation was one recommendation. We also see here the increase of things such as municipal and industrial reuse reuse of municipal and industrial wastewater, as well as looking at alternative water resources, and particularly brackish and produced water as a supplemental source to help prolong the availability of fresh groundwater resources. And from the perspective of governance and policy, looking at management structures that include local governance was something that was highlighted, as well as built-in funding structures that are able to perhaps include a more local management of groundwater. And we see continuing on that theme, from the legislative end, being able to again have funding tied to new initiatives, rather than having sort of new initiatives passed without being funded, essentially, and making the enforcement and compliance and implementation of those a challenge for government agencies, as well as within the sector of produced water, the use of modeling to be able to demonstrate or to look at the costs of reuse of produced water by oil and gas producers compared to the cost of using groundwater along with disposal. Some research or modeling research needs in that area. And one that was, I think this last one is a bit interesting, highlighted as something that was maybe a little bit more unlikely, but was at least brought up, this idea of cross-boundary groundwater management structure with Texas, kind of tying into a previous issue or previous concern that was raised, dealing with the sort of difference in water law with Texas's right of capture, being a concern for this group in the region. And so from these strategies, I think it was able to pull out some visions, some I think really interesting approaches that were brought up by this group. So one would be an approach that would be able to take an active role in aquifer management, not just relying on a sort of permanently withdrawing, say, irrigated farmland from production, but being able to essentially pull back water from production during wet periods and then putting it back into use during dry periods when needed. In the case of the Pecos watershed, being able to bank that water and store it rather than just relying on permanently withdrawing land from production. Another vision I think articulated was being able to maximize the period of having fresh groundwater for those areas that are not connected to surface water. Doing this through the use of non-traditional water resources, sort of softening the landing, so to speak, in terms of the decline of those fresh groundwater resources. Being able to looking at sort of economic changes and dynamics within the region, seeing that long-term a possible transition away from oil, gas, and potash, and into industries that can more fully take advantage of the brackish water resources in the area, as well as an overall use, increased reuse of produced water in a way that can that both protects the health as well, protects public health as well as the environment. And these last two, I'll just quickly move through. It was interesting to remember that Connie mentioned sort of flooding events, and that was something that was brought up here, is being able to take some of these extreme precipitation, these flood events, and take advantage of them through water management, being able to recharge aquifers through those floods, and also as well promoting crop changes that work for growers' livelihoods and can also help with water conservation. Lastly, here in this last slide, I'll just touch on kind of the roadmap beyond or after this conference, Connie as well sort of touched on the overall trajectory of this project. And so most immediately after this conference, we're looking to host additional focus groups, producer focus groups and broader conversations around different regions of the state. The plan right now is to focus on some of the areas that we haven't been able to cover in these three previous focus group conversations, such as Central New Mexico and urban water centers, looking at the Northwest kind of Four Corners region of the state, as well as a crucial component in this that we heard earlier in today's presentation is being able to capture the perspectives of tribes, pueblos, and nations, and getting their input on resilience strategies for the future, as well as I would say too, if there are other suggestions, other stakeholder groups that you all would recommend reaching out to. It's an evolving project, and we would certainly be happy to, if in the chat or connecting after this conference as well, some other suggestions for these focus group meetings and these conversations. And so I'll end saying as well that, you know, the hope the goal of these conversations will be to compile these results into an WRRI report that, as Connie said, will help to feed into the ISC's 50-year water plan. And beyond that as well, there's a component of from here seeking funding to develop other regional offshoot models so that these strategies, that they can be tested and collaboratively implemented in the future. So so I will leave it at that for my presentation.
Looks like there's a question in the chat, Mark.
Okay. Oh, yes, exactly. Okay, yeah, I think I realized I forgot to explicitly mention, but one of the ideas that was brought up was this idea of a kind of local groundwater management districts that you could take a kind of local governance structure with a kind of funding mechanism to help manage the groundwater resources within a particular aquifer, and that would be kind of how these districts would be mapped. So you have the common interest as well as a local structure that also has the funding to be able to implement things such as metering and other kind of enforcement or compliance mechanisms. And
Mark?
See. Yes.
This is Paul Montoya. What you are talking about is something like the groundwater management district on the Rio Grande Conservancy District in that particular idea?
That is,
Mark, we actually have Aaron Bollock in
Okay.
the audience who had brought up I don't know, Aaron, would you be willing to share your vision?
Sure. Why not? Nothing like unveiling a half-cocked idea, right? No, so the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservancy District was formed to manage the groundwater, particularly the groundwater that makes up our artesian aquifer. But I've been circling around this concept that a similar structure could be used for groundwater management in different areas of the state. The advantages have already been discussed, would for one, provide a funding mechanism that would allow for things such as metering and paying for a water master who then is able to do the accounting for the withdrawals from the system, as well as take proactive steps to adjust what's going on within the district. So that's the idea in a nutshell. Have I rendered clear that which was blindingly evident?
Hey, Aaron, this is Patrick McCarthy, and I'm the one who asked the question. So, hey, that really helps me understand a lot what you're getting at and the connection to this, the work that has already been done in the Pecos Valley. And I, for one, would like to explore that idea further. And I think it's really interesting to think about how it could be adapted and applied to other parts of the state that are surely going to need some sort of mechanism like that for sustainability in the future.
Sure. And we're not trying to invent the wheel here. There's groundwater management districts throughout the country. And in fact, yesterday we had a board meeting of the Groundwater District Managers Association. And that's what these people do from Kansas to California and Texas to Mississippi. And there's a ton of these districts throughout the country. A lot of differences, but there's a lot of similarities. And in the long term, that's what every one of them are trying to do, is figure out how we can keep doing what we've been doing on into the future without just exhausting our resource and being left with nothing.
I think what you're talking about too is bringing people to the table with some mechanism so that we could actually talk about the concerns and the similarities that we actually have within our particular watershed, groundwater, whatever.
Absolutely. And for me personally, a huge component of this is that this gives some local controls to what's going on. My board of directors is made up from individuals from within the boundaries of this district. So it's a local board. They're held accountable by the constituents in the valley. And I think there's value in that.
Can I comment briefly? Aaron is right on board, because that artesian basin that he is located is probably one of the better studied areas in the world. So they know what they're doing. And I had, when I worked for the NRCS, back then it was the SCS, I was stationed for 3 years in Lubbock. So that Pecos Valley was in my territory because I was with the federal government. But in aquifer management, and we're working in Texas with a water conservation districts and the SCS, Soil and Water Conservation. They're bottom-up organizations, and they're people. And so when you talk about La Union or wherever you are, or Albuquerque, Bruce Thompson yesterday illustrated how a city can, how they can manage their storm runoff. And we see from Connie's pictures today, every once in a while we get more water than we want, and we have to be smart on how we deal with it. And it can't, empty suits in Washington or Santa Fe cannot tell local people how to take care of their problems. And I sound kind of reactionary, I guess, as an 89-year-old I can, but we have to have this. And all this morning from the tribes, everybody has said, We've got to have control. Then we get action.
John, I'm glad to hear that you like the concept. I'm kind of worried at how those young fellas are going to take it, but if you can get behind it, well, then we got them, right?
Right. We'll call ourselves the Gray Panthers.
Are there any other questions I could not answer? I'll put my email address in the chat box there, and if anybody wants to beat me over the head about it, well, they're welcome to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron. Let's see. I would say I see here a question too about being able to not being able to copy things from the chat and people wanting to have a record of some of the conversation from that was within the Zoom chat today. I would say reach out to me afterwards if that's something you'd like, and because the recording of the meeting automatically saves as well a record of the chat. So reach out and I'd be more than happy to share that with you. It's my I'm really excited to introduce this next session because throughout the planning of this conference, this was something that I think was trying to take advantage of the sort of virtual format in a way that can produce an engaging kind of participatory exercise, looking at some of these questions related to resilience, particularly interdependency, cascading impacts, and systems failure in this context. And so if you attended the pre-conference virtual field trip, you got kind of a sort of sneak peek into what we'll be doing today and some of the background behind it. But you can also, if you go to the agenda within on the conference website, there should be a link where you can view the pre-recorded presentation and find as well some of the other resources that we'll have for this session. But yeah, I'll just quickly introduce our two facilitators for this session and let them kind of I think explain it perhaps a little bit better in their own words. So I'll start with Dagmar Llewellyn, who served as a hydrologist with the Bureau of Reclamation Office in Albuquerque since 2010. She manages projects related to projection of climate change impacts on our watersheds and water supply, and works with other water management agencies and stakeholders to develop and model adaptations that build resilience to these resulting changes. As well, kind of co-facilitating as well is Karen McClune, who is a senior staff scientist with the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition International. Karen has more than 20 years of experience combining technical analysis with stakeholder outreach, discussion and process facilitation in support of planning and policy, with work that's been focused in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and in the US. So Dagmar and Karen, glad to have you participating in this conference. I'll hand it over to you for now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody, and exciting to be with you here today for this, what's going to be a really fun session, exercise we're calling resilience games, to try to apply some of these resilience concepts that we presented in our field trip back on, what day was that? Monday. And which Mark talked about, where there's a recorded version that he's making available, and hopefully a number of you have seen it. What we talked about there was the ways that for systems that well, the components of resilience, and for systems that aren't resilient, the way that system impacts can cascade into one another and result in system failure. We also talked about how system failure doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just something that we need to plan for. So that's what we're hoping to do here today. This is an exercise to evaluate cascading impacts of the 2021 Texas ice storm to understand the ways that Texas could be made more resilient to these kinds of extreme events. As Mark said, I am Dagmar Llewellyn from the Bureau of Reclamation, and need to note that opinions expressed represent those of the speaker, that's me, and not necessarily those of the Bureau of Reclamation. And we also have
Karen McClune with ICID International. We're a nonprofit doing both, as Mark mentioned, domestic and international work on climate change and resilience.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, great. Let's get started here. Hopefully I can advance the screen. So the Texas winter storm of February 2021, I'm talking to a group of New Mexicans who also experienced this winter storm in February 2021 with significantly less impact. It was just a cold event there. But in Texas, well, this cold event, which was made worse by climate change, created widespread freezing temperatures and ice storms. So because of that, power use surged. And while power production, especially from natural gas, diminished. And in New Mexico, we know that happened, the natural gas loss, when we had a real cold event back in 2011. Plenty of us remember that. And there was impacts there and problems that I think that a lot of New Mexico cities have tried to rectify since then. But in Texas, natural gas for home heating was also curtailed, and we heard stories of people trying to run their garages, and there were some deaths as a result, resulting from carbon monoxide poisoning there. Karen will talk about more of those things, but many thousands of Texans were left without heat and electricity, and impacts cascaded through critical life-sustaining systems. You can see here in this picture on the right, things were pretty bad in Texas. And there were a number of reasons that Texas had resilience challenges that New Mexico didn't necessarily. There was a surge in energy demand, which exceeded what Texas had planned for, resulting in widespread power failures and inability of Texans to heat their home. Texans had chosen to keep Texas itself had chosen to keep its power grid for about 90% of the state, for which the power is overseen by the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. Independent from the power grid for the rest of the United States. So there was no backup when there was a shortage within that system. They couldn't just get the power from elsewhere. In those ERCOT regions, power generators are disincentivized to winterize their systems. So a few of them had a lot of challenges because of that. And power generators there are also authorized to dramatically increase prices for power shortages. And as I think you all heard the news stories of people getting $24,000 bills for their houses and things like that. So there were a number of resilience challenges there, and Karen's going to talk about how they cascaded through systems, like supporting systems.
So particularly from the perspective of someone that does international development work, just because you have a power failure or a blackout doesn't mean you should have a disaster. And most developing countries are actually well adapted to the power just arbitrarily going off, sometimes for hours. They adapt to it, they have backup systems if they need them, and they just work with it. And yet in the US, we're quite dependent on power. We're used to having a regular power supply. And so for us, unless we are very intentional about our backups, when the power goes down, it tends to cause other failures. And that's what becomes a disaster. And we saw that in Texas. So when the power went down to water treatment plants. And to wastewater treatment plants. And so potable water and wastewater were impacted. Boil water notices were issued from many of the potable water plants. But also because power was lost to individual homes, pipes froze. And so even people that might have otherwise had power or had water, lost their water supply. Shelter, people's homes were not particularly useful as shelter because they were unheated. And people looked for creative ways to deal with that, but in many cases actually made their situation worse. For example, bringing things indoors to burn does cause carbon monoxide to build up, and Texas does not require carbon monoxide monitors in homes. But then there were also everything attached to the power system. There were cascading failures there. There were also cascading failures within the transportation system. And if you go to the next slide, Dagmar, just the fact that it was a snow and ice storm meant that roads were difficult to travel. It impacted people getting to and from work. It also impacted shipping. So I live in Boulder, Colorado, and shop at Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's it took them weeks, like 4 or 6 weeks to kind of get fully restocked because several of their warehouses are in Texas and trucks couldn't get in and out. So there were supply chain issues that radiated out far beyond Texas. And this was sort of a separate set of impacts, but then there were places where power outages and transportation network outages kind of came together to create different potential failures or challenges. If you think about small businesses that tend to have tight margins already, what happens if you lose power or you get an extreme energy bill and you've had supply chain issues and maybe your staff hasn't gotten to work? Like I expect, this event alone may result in small business closures for some small businesses, or certainly extreme hardship. And so it's some of these connections that we want you to start playing with, because it is those places where the interconnections and the cascades really lead to disasters. And if we get better as a society about recognizing these interconnections and thinking about how we need to build in backups and safety measures so that we don't trigger them, we'll all be better off.
Thanks, Karen. That was great. So as we talked about, you'll be doing an exercise to follow these pathways of cascading failures. And we're providing you, I think Mark will provide an Excel spreadsheet that is an annotated background research summary that you can use to get some information. We've annotated it with sort of the basic gist of each of these articles. This is in no way comprehensive. I'm sure you all read news articles about what happened down in Texas in February, and the articles you read may or may not be here, but this is a resource for you to help you tackle the project that we have you trying over the next hour.
So we know you can't read this. We don't want you to read this. But what we're going to do is move everyone into breakout groups and have you work in a Miro board, which is basically an online, sticky note board, to start putting together your own map of the ways different systems are interconnected and how impacts in one place then cascade into the next, and where those linkages are. And so this is just sort of a very rough sample, and we're anticipating that what you come up with may not look anything like this. And that would be really exciting, actually, to see the different ways that different groups handle this. Next slide. So in your breakout group, you'll be given a link, kind of like this. And if you click on that link, and if Dagmar can do that, it will take you to a Miro board. And what I like about Miro is it's very easy to just step into and use, even if you never have. So we're going to give you just a rough setup like this, where we have sort of our power system failure here in the center. That's me. Water and wastewater systems. You're welcome to break those out if you want to think about them separately. maybe what happened to households, to the health system, which was already under stress when this event hit because of COVID, businesses. And then I had over here, there were the power system failures. There was also the whole transportation network impacts that kind of cascade differently. And we have just some thoughts to get you started. There's some sticky notes down here that you can grab and move if you want, to wherever you need on the board. You can expand your board or shrink it on the side over here. And then if you want to grab new stickies, you come over to the bar on this side. On the left, you can grab a sticky, put it where you want it, and then you just type in it when it's highlighted. To connect a sticky with an arrow, you can also just grab an arrow from the same bar and connect it up. So with that introduction, I think that'll be all you need to get going. And we're excited to see what you come up with. And I would just note that this may feel like a very simple exercise, but once you get going, you find a lot of connections that you might or might not have anticipated. And it really does build a different way of thinking. And it's definitely better done in groups. So we encourage you to work together and collaborate on this.
Okay. All right, then. Well, what I'm going to do from my end then, just so you all know what to expect, is I'm going to create a set of 15 breakout rooms. So we'll keep the numbers for each room small enough to kind of have a nice little collaborative team feel and allow everyone to give their input into the whiteboard. And what will happen is after those boards are created, myself and Jeanette Torres will go around and we'll be distributing each breakout group's whiteboard link. So you might have to wait a little bit. We'll try to do it as fast as we can, just popping in and out, giving you your link, and then within that group, you all can go from there and try your hand at this. So without further ado, okay, let's see here. Okay, and I'm going to open all these rooms now.
You guys have a good breakout group?
Well, we found out we're computer illiterate, so we had a hard time getting the lines to work with what we were thinking.
Yeah, we played around with that for a while also, but we ultimately got a bunch of scribbles all over the place.
That was kind of the idea, Rolf.
Well, they may be meaningful to somebody, Dagmar. And heck, Karen, good to see you.
Hi. Yeah, good to see you.
I saw you moving through our screen and helping us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's part of the point. Like, once you start looking at interconnections, it becomes spaghetti really fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was fun. It's kind of interesting. Our little group spent a lot of time thinking, because we had that power outage here about 7 years ago with gas. And
2011.
Yeah, and it's amazing how quickly some of that comes back to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we set up here in Northwest New Mexico with all kinds of electric generation and all that kind of stuff. So we were kind of laughing at the rest of the state when the gas went out, and we were in pretty good shape.
Yeah, you had a redundant supply, one of the elements of resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
Well, one of the things that I looked at pretty intensely is the wastewater stuff. And because of that Gold King mine spill, we I don't know if we did or not, but we were talking about water buffaloes coming in and supplying water where we needed it. And
Yeah.
so when I brought up water buffaloes, everybody else was laughing at me because they'd never heard the term before. So, and the other thing too is that most of our sites, in fact, all of our sites, well, no, I can't say that back because we own an electrical grid, but in Hayes, where I came from, all of our sites had gas generators, natural gas generators on site so we could run the water treatment and the wastewater plant. But if the gas is frozen up, you're kind of hosed in that perspective. But I know that some cities have diesel generators and that sort of thing. So they're not quite as prone to freezing as, because they're treated, you know, they naturally treat the diesel so that it doesn't freeze. So they have the alternative to, that's one of the redundancies they have built into their system.
So did others include the sort of corollary emergency of COVID going on in the background of all of this, and how that played into the sort of the overall story, such as compounding the supply lines?
We talked about that a little bit, saying, I think we just kind of incorporated it as part of the situation.
Yeah,
Not necessarily shutting everything down, but you know, if you're out of, say, an earthquake and you don't have any electricity for your gas pumps, COVID is an important part of moving gas around to those various areas, but it's not an overlying issue. It's part of the problem, it's not, you know what I'm trying to say? Trying to say that it's part of the problem, but it's not the dominating problem at the time, I guess.
So
we
right,
had that
but
discussion in
it's a
Hiram.
threat multiplier, right?
Right, there you go.
Yeah, Hiram, who's on here, had the point and brought it up all through, is that just thinking about it from the perspective of the cold snap and the loss of power, many of the things that we were putting down as sticky notes were things that have been occurring through the pandemic itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. No, one of the things I was reading about the other day is that we may be looking at rolling blackouts this summer going through New Mexico. And I don't know that we've ever experienced that here in this state. So it'll be interesting to see how we adapt to that situation.
I've been wondering what's going to happen when Lake Powell drops below the power pool, if we're not able to come up with an operation that supports it.
All those people are going to continue to move Colorado. So if you buy some stock in U-Haul, it's probably a good idea right now, because they're all going to be leaving the state, no electricity.
But Texas had a vulnerability because they were not connected to the larger Western power grid, right? But New Mexico is, right? And so that's why Rolf brings up the vulnerability of sort of major loss of power production in another part of that grid. So we could be on the sort of giving end of that excess power, right?
Yeah.
And the other problem here too is that if we're moving to solar power to be our domineering electrical supply, that transition period from coal and natural gas to solar powered is going to leave us in a vulnerable position should a natural disaster happen, such as this thing that I just talked about temperatures going to 120 degrees for months on end, like it did in the northwest corner of the United States.
Yeah, good points. Karen brought up that much as it's great to get electric vehicles, if you have to suddenly evacuate because of a wildfire or something like that, you might not be able to in those electric vehicles if you don't have the power production in order.
Yeah.
It is a complex web we weave.
If it's how do I want to say it would be just like me if I had one to forget to plug it in, and then in the middle of the night we have a fire and can't get out of Dallas,
Okay.
Yeah, this is a great discussion. Is there anybody else who wants to step up and talk about any other interesting relationships that they found? There's a lot of interesting things on this board that I'm looking at here. things like political implications that might feed back to whether resilience is then built in the system to help respond to other emergencies, impact of other emergencies that are going on at the same time, communication challenges. Does anybody else want to step up and say anything about ideas that they had? I know Connie has ideas.
Good to see you, Dagmar. Great little piece of software. We were kind of trying to navigate around some of the connections, and I think one of the things we stumbled upon, of course, was the examples for the El Paso region being not as impacted, being twofold, both the federal oversight and regulation as well as the cold weather upgrades. So we started kind of playing around with that, and we're like, well, how about some federal oversight and regulation that limits profiteering from using power as a scarcity, and one of the ideas that came up in our group was to set a maximum price on energy and to incentivize the maximization of quantity of power production. If there's a maximum price, you're going to get your profit through quantity.
I'd like to argue that point from an economic point of view. And one of the things you learn in economics right off the bat is supply and demand.
Mm-hmm.
So as supply increases, demand goes down, vice versa as supply decreases. And I think it's a really good idea if that kind of remains the thing. One of the things I want to bring up that we talked about was we've really changed the way we communicate. Everybody has a cell phone now. So if we don't have any power generated, how are we going to power those cell phones? And I believe that the telephone company has its own power generation. So they're not particularly reliant on the grid as much as the electric utilities are.
Yeah. So another area that we were just getting to on our sheet, had to do with the impacts to agricultural systems. Now, this was in the winter, but certainly people had livestock that they were trying to keep alive, and there were concerns about that. Also, supply lines, if food needed to be brought in, that sort of thing. I see Wade Holdeman's here. Wade, do you want to say anything about that?
I'm sorry, Dagmar, could you repeat that question, please?
Sure, yeah. We were just getting to the idea of looking at the impacts of the ice storm on agricultural systems. For example, people trying to keep livestock alive, or get supply lines to get food to livestock, that sort of thing. So I just thought you might want to weigh in on those kinds of impacts and how we might build resilience into those systems.
Well, you need to have a little bit of a paradigm shift on that from the Dallas scenario, because most of the livestock producers are in a more rural area where they are typically more self-sufficient. So there's a little bit of a different component in that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So people are self-sufficient, say, for example, they might not rely on direct supply lines, but may have some food available for their livestock, in stock locally, that sort of thing.
There would be a lot of that. I'm relating this back to the stories that I heard about around 2000 in Nabaca County, whenever there was a 3-foot snowfall, and there were areas, as rural as some of the ranchers are, they actually couldn't get to where they needed to feed cattle, and I think they actually called in National Guard, somebody.
Yeah, they had helicopters going
and delivered feed. So there was some of that had happened, but if we was in that situation in a rural area here in Nabaca County, rural area, and the power supply went out and we could not pump gas at our local filling stations, that would pose a serious problem. I don't know how many days, before we would need to, would be, gridlock and not be able to, perform anymore. So, because, a longer term, I don't know how long it'd take for somebody to come up with a solution, but, thinking ahead, it would be good to have, generators or some other source of having fuel for transportation available.
Right, right.
I know in Houston, because Texas does these sorts of disasters a lot, I guess. Heb, one of the big grocery store chains that also runs gas stations, has invested in generators, and they're now also a source of power and food and coffee and whatever else for first responders. They've just, they've stepped in where the government doesn't, I suppose.
Great.
There was that story about the Ford truck guy who had a generator on his truck. And I've also heard of people with other electric vehicles that can be used for power generation. If that's all you have. So, electric vehicles actually could help people stay warm and dry and have some power for essential things.
Yeah, I have a number of friends in Northern California who've been either subjected to no power or power outages for a period of time or fire, right? And they're lucky enough to be able to get loans on their houses and stuff, but a lot of them have put in solar. They now have backup generators, and they have that ability, with a hybrid vehicle and stuff like that too, to charge or to not. And they've just kind of been driven to that point in the last few years because of the lack of reliability in those systems and the worries about fire.
Right.
But I don't know how many people can do that. That's we have in New Mexico. I think that would be really hard. I don't think people have the resources to do that. In California, the housing prices were going up, so a lot of them were able to get kind of home equity loans and do that kind of thing. Maybe we can do that in New Mexico now after these recent uptick in prices, but yeah, I doubt it for a large part of it.
So I think it's important to keep in mind, you're dancing around the edge of this, that resilience happens at different scales, right? So you can build resilience into your power grid, for example, by expanding so you can draw resources from other areas. There's vulnerability, as you pointed out, Rolf, in doing that too. If you're feeling like you're not getting that resilience at a regional or state level, then like these people in California and the wildfire impacted areas are starting to feel like they need to build that resilience on their own, right, to keep their own systems operating. But as we pointed out in the presentation that we gave on Monday, it doesn't necessarily help you if your house survives the storm or the wildfire or something like that, but you've got no water, you've got no wastewater treatment, you've got no power supply coming into it, that sort of thing. But it would keep you sort of alive in the moment and able to evacuate. So Hannah, thoughts from you? See you nodding. You haven't weighed in yet.
Well, I would actually just share something from Grace maybe, which was that, say you have trouble with your water system and power goes out, and then that creates either that creates other emergencies, like say fires if lines are down, right? Or what if some other emergency happens coincidentally and you have no ability to address that? So I think, we did some talking about that in our group. And then also this was raised earlier, just communications, like what happens if, cell phone service is not up and running and people don't, what is the backup in terms of informing people in terms of emergency response? And that made me think of just what's happened recently in Gulf Coast hurricanes, where, a lot of people had no access to information. And so what does that do, right? So just thinking, those are some ideas from our group.
Yeah, that's great. Karen, you did some analysis of that in the Boulder flood study.
I mean, yeah, communication is critical. both once something has started unfolding, but also in advance. I thought it was interesting that in this Texas cold event, they didn't have an established means to reach out to customers and ask them to reduce demand. So that wasn't even a possible avenue for addressing the surge. They knew the cold was coming, and that's certainly a piece that if New Mexico is worried about summer demand during hot times, setting up those systems now so that you can reach out to customers and say, okay, we're expecting really hot weather. We know the system is going to be taxed because it's also been really dry. Do what you can to reduce use.
So here I am in Massachusetts now, and there's been, just came through one nor'easter and had a few other things going on this summer, and we get these reverse 911 calls from the town that I'm in. So that's sort of one mechanism to, as long as people have phone access, which is something that Hannah brought up. So, but with that, then you can get an automated individual response. Here's what's going to happen. Please try to keep your usage down.
Bring some water back.
Yeah, I'll try. There's plenty here. Oh my God.
Dagmar, you have a couple of hands raised. I know that those aren't always apparent. Bob Wesley was first and Elaine Hubbard was second.
Thanks, Connie.
You're
Bob?
welcome.
I guess I just wanted to point out that one of the things that's needed is the recognition at each level, at personal, family, community, that to build resilience, you got to spend money. And we've got a terrible resistance to doing that because the problem isn't here today, it's in the next term of office. And so I think that's just the key ingredient that we need to recognize. That's my pitch.
Right. No, that's an important thing to point out, Bob, and that's at all levels. That's at your individual household level up to, say, the state or regional level where there needs to be investment in power grids, those sorts of things. And there, we saw in Texas, there was a disincentive to the power companies to winterize, right? Because they were able to sort of pass off the implications of not winterizing into their customers rather than absorbing it in their own profit line. So, you have to think where that cost falls as well. We just have a couple of minutes, so let's go to Elaine as well. And if you put your hand down now, Bob, we'd appreciate that. Thanks.
I just wanted to follow up on what Bob said, and our group sort of focused on those circles of communication from the personal to the neighborhood to the regional, city, and then state, and the levels of responsibility and planning that needs to be done so that, like, an Amber Alert would go out and saying, this is what you need to do. Like, you need to turn off your pipe, your tap or whatever, so it's not dripping outside. Or so building on those circles and thinking also about your presentation on Monday, the modularity, the redundancy. And so all of that sort of gets built in as you look forward and you make your emergency plans. And so what we focused on really was sort of moving forward, but it was the communication and the planning that became sort of top in our discussions, I would say.
That's great. Yeah, planning is certainly a key part of being ready for these kinds of emergencies. And I like your multi-scale approach, looking at the sort of circles that we're in that we can.
Well, some people, you have I think I have said, people have a responsibility.
Sure, to their neighbors, to be part of a resilient system. Absolutely, good point. We just have 2 minutes left here, so I thank everybody for a really great discussion on this topic. I think this worked out really well. I hope everybody had fun and learned a lot, and hopefully this will help us to build more resilient systems in New Mexico. I'm going to pass it back to Mark so that he can say some closing lines for the day and talk about what's happening tomorrow.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dagmar, and thank you so much, Karen, as well, for all of your hard work and effort in this with this session and leading this. I think this really insightful discussion afterwards. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I guess some news for tomorrow. Tomorrow is our last day of the conference, and we really hope to get some insight and perspectives from our conference attendees on resilience, adaptation and mitigation strategies looking forward in the next 50 years, within different sectors such as agriculture, environmental and habitat, watershed and habitat health, commercial and energy, recreation. Within these groups, what are the ways that we can look forward in coming up with strategies and recommendations? So I'm looking forward to seeing you all there tomorrow. Before that kicks on, or before we kick off with some flash talk presentations at 10 tomorrow, we'll have part 2 of our virtual poster session, where you'll be able to interact with another batch of our poster presenters this year. So don't want you to miss out on that. A chance to talk with students and other researchers about research that's ongoing throughout New Mexico. But I just want to say thank you, everyone, for attending. One small thing. I know there's a little prize giveaway to announce. So I have here attendee Mark Sanchez winning one of our WRRI water bottles, and then Michelle Del Valle winning a copy of 100 Years of Water Wars in New Mexico. So thank you so much to everyone, and I hope to see you all back here tomorrow for the last day of the 66th Annual New Mexico Water Conference.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you tomorrow.